Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy wooden door of a medieval manor house where a 7-year-old girl has just been told that playtime is over forever. You can smell the rushes on the stone floor, mixed with wood smoke and the faint sweetness of dried lavender. Somewhere in the solar above, women's voices murmur in steady rhythm as needles pierce linen. Your childhood ended this morning when your mother took away your worn leather ball and replaced it with a spindle. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why so many fairy tales feature girls locked in towers learning to spin gold from straw, or why the phrase well-bred woman still carries weight in our modern vocabulary. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether it's a cozy bedroom in Toronto or a quiet apartment in Manila. Maybe share what you think medieval childhood was really like, or if you've ever wondered why wedding traditions feel so ancient and prescribed. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in the great hall, and everything has changed. Yesterday, you ran through the kitchen gardens with your brothers, your hem muddy and your braids half undone. Today, your mother's hand rests firmly on your shoulder as she explains that you are no longer a child. In medieval Europe, the age of 7 marked a profound transformation. The church considered it the age of reason, the moment when a soul became accountable for sin. For boys, this meant beginning apprenticeships or page training. For you, a girl born into the nobility or even the prosperous merchant class, it meant something entirely different. It meant becoming a project, a commodity, a future bride. The training begins immediately, and it's more rigorous than you ever imagined. You're not learning to read romances or compose poetry. Those are luxuries for a tiny elite. Instead, you're learning to survive in a world where your value is measured by your marriageability. And marriageability means mastering an impossible list of skills. Your mother walks you to the solar, that precious upper room where the women of the household gather in the best light. The air here smells different, of beeswax and wool, of rosewater and the particular metallic scent of silver thread. 6 women sit in a semicircle, their heads bent over embroidery frames. Not one of them looks up when you enter. This, you'll learn, is your first lesson. A well-trained woman doesn't interrupt or draw attention. Your aunt pats the cushion beside her, and you sit, trying to copy the straight-backed posture she maintains effortlessly. She hands you a piece of linen stretched over a wooden hoop, already marked with a simple pattern of flowers. The needle she gives you is precious. Needles are expensive, sometimes listed in wills alongside jewellery. Small stitches, she whispers, even tension. A man judges a woman's character by her needlework. You want to ask why a man's character isn't judged by his stitching, but you already sense that such questions have no place here. Historians have documented extensive evidence that noble women spent an average of 6 hours daily on textile work, not because they needed clothes, but because embroidery, weaving, and spinning were visible proof of feminine virtue and patience. The days begin to blur into a pattern as rigid as the embroidery designs you practice. You wake at dawn when the servant rings the bell for lauds. Before you eat, you kneel for prayers. Already you're learning that a good Christian wife puts spiritual duty before physical comfort. Breakfast is brief, usually bread soaked in weak ale, and then you return to the solar, Sometimes you practice spinning, learning to tease wool into thread of consistent thickness. The older women tell stories while they work, but you notice the stories are always about patient wives rewarded or impatient wives punished. Saint Margaret, who emerged from a dragon's belly because of her purity. Saint Catherine, who refused marriage and was martyred. The message underneath is always the same. Women who submit to God and to male authority are protected. Women who rebel are destroyed. By mid-morning, your fingers ache and your eyes water from concentrating on tiny stitches, but there's no rest. Your mother arrives to teach you deportment, the way you move your body through space. You practice walking with a book balanced on your head, learning to glide rather than bounce. A lady doesn't hurry, your mother says, though you notice she herself rushes constantly, managing the enormous household. You practice curtsying at different depths for different ranks, a shallow dip for your social equals, a deeper genuflection for your betters, and an even deeper one for the Lord when he returns from hunting. You practice keeping your eyes lowered, your hands folded, your expression serene. Men don't trust women who smile too much. Your aunt remarks, it suggests loose morals. The afternoons bring different lessons. Sometimes you accompany the chamberlain's wife to the storerooms, learning to recognize quality linen from inferior weaves, to spot mold on grain, to calculate how many pounds of candles the household burns in a month. This is mathematics without numbers, learned through touch and experience. A well-trained bride must know how to manage servants, prevent theft, and stretch resources through long winters. You learn that a competent household manager can make her husband wealthy through careful stewardship, while an incompetent one can bankrupt a family in a single season. The pressure is immense, and you're only 7 years old. Historians still argue whether medieval childhood truly existed as we understand it today, or whether children were simply treated as small adults once they passed infancy. The evidence from bridal training suggests something in between. You're recognized as young and in need of instruction, but you're also expected to master adult responsibilities with adult-level competence. There's no concept of adolescence as a protected exploratory phase. You move directly from early childhood into intensive vocational training per sounds, and your vocation is marriage. One quirky detail that rarely appears in textbooks. Many noble families hired older widows specifically to teach young girls the secret signs of household management. These women, called mother deputies in some regions, knew which servants were likely thieves, how to tell if the cook was watering the wine, and how to hide small valuables from dishonest stewards. They passed down a kind of counter-surveillance knowledge, teaching girls to protect their future marital assets. It was almost like training spies, except your mission field was your own home, and your enemies were the people you'd employ. By evening, you're exhausted, but the day isn't over. After supper in the great hall, where you sit valiantly among the women and eat tiny portions to demonstrate your delicate appetite, you return to the solar for more needlework. The light is fading de voir, but you work by candlelight now, which is both a privilege and another test of your dedication. Your mother quizzes you on heraldry. You must learn to recognize the coats of arms of every important family in the region, because knowing who your husband's allies and enemies are might one day save your life. She also begins teaching you the basics of medieval medicine, which herbs reduce fever, how to prepare a poultice for wounds, what to do if someone in the household falls ill. In an era before professional doctors were common, the lady of the manor was often the only medical care available. As you finally climb the stairs to the chamber, you share with your sisters and cousins. Your hands are cramped, your back aches, and your head swims with information. You're 7 years old, and this is now your life. tomorrow will be identical, and the day after, and the day after that. You have perhaps 8 to 10 years before you'll be married, and every single day will be spent preparing for that moment. You fall asleep wondering what your future husband looks like, whether he'll be kind, whether you'll even meet him before the wedding. But these aren't really questions you're allowed to ask aloud. A well-trained bride accepts what's given and makes the best of it. That's the first and most important lesson, and it's already sinking into your bones like the cold from the stone walls. You've been living in Lady Eleanor's household for 3 months now, and the manor feels less like a home and more like a peculiar kind of school where the curriculum is your entire future. Your parents sent you here when you turned 8, following a custom that wealthy families have practiced for generations: fosterage, the medieval version of finishing school combined with strategic networking. You arrived with a small wooden chest containing 2 shifts, a wool dress, your prayer book, and a silver thimble your grandmother pressed into your palm with trembling fingers. Lady Eleanor greeted you formally in the great hall, her eyes assessing you the way a horse trader examines a mare. Within an hour, you were absorbed into the rhythm of her household. Just another girl among the 6 others learning to become valuable brides. The ladies' chamber, where you spend most of your waking hours, occupies the southeast corner of the manor's upper floor. 2 glass windows, actual glass, which announces Lady Eleanor's wealth more loudly than words, let in precious light. The walls are hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and the floor is covered with woven mats instead of common rushes. A brazier keeps the room warm enough that your fingers don't go numb while you sew. Though in deep winter, even this privileged space will become uncomfortable. The room smells perpetually of rose water, wool, and the beeswax candles that burn on the large work table. This is your classroom, your laboratory, your training ground. Lady Eleanor herself is a fascinating contradiction. She's 43 years old, a widow who managed to negotiate unusual independence after her husband's death. She runs this estate with iron efficiency, making decisions about crop rotation and tenant disputes that would normally fall to a male lord. Yet the lessons she teaches you are all about submission, obedience, and pleasing future husbands. "Do as I teach, not as I do," she said once with a wry smile. And you understood that her widowhood has given her freedoms that you'll likely never taste. She's preparing you for traditional marriage while living an entirely untraditional life herself. Historians still argue whether widows like Lady Eleanor undermined or reinforced medieval gender norms. They were simultaneously the freest women in society and the most invested in perpetuating the system that would oppress their daughters. The daily schedule is relentless. You wake when the chapel bells ring for prime, around 6 in the morning, after prayers and a quick breakfast of bread, small beer. You enter the ladies' chamber for the morning's first lesson, embroidery and needlework. But this isn't just about making pretty things. Lady Eleanor explains that your needlework will be examined by potential mothers-in-law like a resume. The fineness of your stitches demonstrates patience. The complexity of your patterns shows intelligence and taste. The neatness of the reverse side, which Lady Eleanor always inspects, reveals your character. A woman who's careless on the hidden side of her embroidery will be careless in hidden aspects of household management. She says, "You've spent weeks working on a single altar cloth, and your fingers are permanently pricked and sore around mid-morning." The lesson shifts to posture and movement. Lady Eleanor's assistant, a stern woman named Mathilde, who never married and seems quietly bitter about it, walks among you with a willow switch, not to strike, though the threat hovers, but to tap gently against spines that curve, shoulders that hunch, necks that crane forward. "A lady's body is always composed," Mathilde intones. "Slouching suggests laziness. Rapid movement suggests immodesty. A proper woman moves through space like a swan on water, serene on the surface, working hard beneath. You practice walking while balancing small leather books on your head. You practice sitting on a backless stool for an hour without shifting your weight. You practice standing perfectly still while Matilda circles you, adjusting the angle of your chin, the position of your hands folded at your waist, the precise placement of your feet. One of the other girls, Alice, whispered to you last week that she heard her older sister collapsed on her wedding night from wearing a corset laced too tightly for too many hours. The point wasn't the corset itself, those wouldn't become truly fashionable for another few centuries, but the broader lesson. Women's bodies must be disciplined, constrained, and made uncomfortable to achieve the proper aesthetic of nobility. You're learning that discomfort is part of femininity. Beauty, according to medieval standards, involves suffering quietly and maintaining grace despite physical pain. It's a lesson you'll carry in your muscles and bones for the rest of your life. The afternoon brings what Lady Eleanor calls conversational arts, which turns out to be far more complicated than talking. You learn that speaking too much makes you seem forward and immodest. Speaking too little makes you seem simple-minded. The perfect bride speaks just enough, on appropriate topics, in a pleasant tone, without ever dominating the conversation or contradicting male speakers. You practice with role-playing exercises that would be funny if they weren't so serious. Matilda pretends to be a lord discussing hunting, and you must find ways to respond that show interest without revealing knowledge, because God forbid you know more about falconry than your husband's guests. Oh, how thrilling that must have been, my lord. You practice saying, your voice carefully modulated between enthusiasm and deference. You also learn the language of strategic silence. When men discuss politics, you embroider quietly nearby, absorbing information without acknowledging it. When family conflicts arise, you lower your eyes and still your hands, becoming invisible while remaining present. Lady Eleanor teaches you to read social situations through peripheral vision and subtle cues. A tightening of someone's jaw, a change in breathing pattern, the particular quality of statements that precedes an argument. Your survival may one day depend on knowing when to absent yourself from a room, she says, and you understand she's speaking from experience. A quirky historical detail. Some wealthy households actually had listening posts, small alcoves where women could hear conversations in the Great Hall without being seen, allowing them to gather intelligence that might protect their interests. 3 afternoons a week, you receive instruction in music, not for artistic expression, but as another marketable skill. You learn to play the psaltery, a stringed instrument perfect for accompanying devotional songs. Your voice is trained to stay within a narrow, pleasant range, never too loud, never too dramatic. You memorize songs in French and Latin, languages you barely understand, because a cultured bride should be able to entertain guests after dinner. During one lesson, you ask Lady Eleanor if women ever compose music themselves. She pauses, then mentions Hildegard von Bingen, the abbess whose compositions have spread throughout Christian Europe. But she was a nun, Lady Eleanor adds, and even she faced accusations of overreaching her proper station. Safer to perform others' work prettily than to create your own and risk accusations of pride. The education extends beyond the lady's chamber. You accompany Lady Eleanor on her rounds of the estate, learning to inspect the dairy for cleanliness, to recognize when grain stores are being depleted too quickly, to smell the difference between fresh rushes and ones beginning to rot. You learn to count without seeming to count, a useful skill when you need to verify that the correct number of chickens has been delivered or that a servant hasn't skimmed cream from the milk. This practical education is perhaps the most valuable you receive, because these are skills you'll actually use. A medieval noblewoman wasn't purely decorative. She was expected to run a complex economic operation efficiently. The estate functioned as a small business, producing food, cloth and trade goods, and you're being trained as a future manager. Evening lessons focus on religious instruction. Lady Eleanor herself leads these sessions, and her knowledge of scripture and saints' lives is genuinely impressive. But the lessons always circle back to the same themes. Women's natural sinfulness inherited from Eve, the virtue of wifely obedience modelled by the Virgin Mary, the suffering of martyred saints who remained pure. You memorize prayers that emphasize submission and humility. You study cautionary tales about women whose pride or curiosity led to disaster. From Eve to Pandora to various unfortunate queens who meddled in affairs beyond their understanding. The message is clear. Knowledge is dangerous for women. Curiosity is sinful, and questioning authority is a path to damnation. Yet Lady Eleanor sometimes says things that contradict these lessons. Late one evening, after the other girls had gone to bed, she found you still awake, struggling with a particularly complex embroidery pattern. She sat beside you and said, "Everything we teach you is a cage, but it's a cage that might keep you alive. Learn to work within it while keeping some part of yourself free. That's the real art." You didn't fully understand, but you sensed she was offering you something precious. Permission to maintain an inner life separate from your outer performance. Do you remember how exhausting the first weeks were? Now, 3 months in, the schedule has become automatic. Your hands move through embroidery patterns while your mind drifts. Your body maintains perfect posture without conscious thought. You're being transformed, cell by cell, into the type of woman medieval society values. But sometimes, late at night when the other girls are sleeping, you wonder who you might have become in a different world. Then you push the thought away, because wondering is dangerous. You've already learned that much. You're 10 years old when you overhear your father discussing your marriage contract in the small accounting room off the Great Hall. His voice carries through the gap beneath the door. Numbers, parcels of land, promises about your dowry. You press yourself against the cold stone wall, heart pounding, straining to hear the name of your future husband. But the man being discussed isn't someone you'll meet for years. He's 5 years old right now, the youngest son of a baron 3 counties away. Your father is arranging your future with a child who still plays with wooden swords and probably doesn't know you exist. This is how medieval marriage works, not as a romantic union between 2 people who've grown to know each other, but as a business contract negotiated by families seeking advantage, alliance, and the careful preservation of wealth and bloodlines. The betrothal of children was so common in medieval Europe that the church eventually had to create specific rules about it. Canon law established that children could be betrothed from age 7, that same age when you stopped being a child and started your training. But the marriage couldn't be consummated until the girl reached 12 and the boy reached 14. These ages were considered the onset of puberty, though by modern medical standards they're really shockingly young. However, here's where it gets more complicated. Just because betrothals happened early didn't mean the actual marriages did. Wealthy families often arranged betrothals and then waited years before completing the marriage, sometimes until the bride was 15, 16, or even older. The betrothal itself was the valuable part. It locked in the alliance and prevented either family from making a competing arrangement. Your mother finds you eavesdropping and pulls you away by your elbow, her grip firm but not angry. Later, in the solar while you're practicing your tablet weaving, She sits beside you and explains what you heard. Your betrothal has been arranged to the De Courcy family. In exchange for your hand, your father will provide a dowry of 40 marks in silver, a dozen sheep, 2 milk cows, 3 chests of linens you've been helping to embroider for years, and a small manor house on the eastern edge of your family's holdings. The De Courcy family, in return, has agreed that you'll receive a dower, a portion of your husband's estate that will support you if you outlive him. 1/3 of his lands, and specifically, which is the standard arrangement. Your mother explains this as if describing a recipe for marchpane, her voice steady and practical, and she doesn't ask how you feel. Your feelings aren't relevant to these negotiations, but here's the peculiar detail that historians love to debate. Once a betrothal was formalized, it was almost as binding as marriage itself. Breaking a betrothal could result in lawsuits, demands for compensation, even violence between families. Some girls were betrothed multiple times as both families played a complex game of alliance building, with each betrothal giving way to a more advantageous one, until someone finally went through with an actual wedding. You knew a girl in Lady Ellesner's household whose betrothal was broken when she was 11 because her intended husband's family was accused of treason. She was devastated, not because she loved the boy she'd never met, but because the scandal tainted her reputation. She ended up marrying a wool merchant instead of a knight, a significant step down in status. The betrothal system was supposed to provide security, but it often created a different kind of vulnerability. The formal betrothal ceremony happens on a cold November morning when you're 10 and a half. Your intended husband and his family travel to your father's manor for the occasion. You finally see the boy who will someday be your husband, a small, thin child with dark hair and nervous eyes, wearing an elaborate tunic that seems too large for him. He looks as terrified as you feel. The ceremony takes place in your family's chapel, presided over by the local priest. Your father and the boy's father do most of the talking, reciting formal promises in Latin that you struggle to follow. At one point, you and the boy are required to join hands while the priest blesses the union. His palm is sweaty and cold. Oh, cool. He won't meet your eyes. You're both children being swept along by forces neither of you controls. After the ceremony, there's feast, and you're seated beside your betrothed at the high table. You're supposed to make conversation to begin building the relationship that will define your adult life. But what do you say to a 5-year-old boy? You ask about his favourite games, he mumbles something about his pony, you mention that you like the estate's garden, he picks at his food and says nothing. His mother, seated nearby, watches this interaction with sharp eyes, clearly evaluating whether you'll be a suitable wife for her son. You straighten your spine, modulate your voice to its most pleasant tone, and try to demonstrate all the training Lady Eleanor has drilled into you. You're performing femininity for an audience that will judge your worthiness, and you're only 10 years old. The absurdity of the situation would make you laugh if you weren't so terrified of failing. The legal documents are signed in your father's accounting room after the feast. You're not present for this part. The actual business of marriage contracts is men's work, but later, your mother shows you the parchment with its elaborate seals and careful script. She points out the clauses that protect you, the dower arrangement, a promise that you'll be maintained in a manner befitting your station, a provision that if your husband dies before the marriage is consummated, a portion of your dowry must be returned to your family. These protections matter because medieval marriage could be financially devastating for women. Without clear contractual agreements, a widow might find herself homeless, her children disinherited, her dowry absorbed into her late husband's estate. The contract is, in a sense, the only power you'll ever have, and even that power is limited and contingent. Historians still argue whether medieval marriage was truly as mercenary as it appears in these contracts. Some scholars point to love letters between spouses, to stories of genuine partnerships, to evidence that emotional bonds did develop even in arranged marriages. Others insist that romantic love as we understand it today simply wasn't a factor in medieval marriage. That was for poetry and courtly fantasy, not real life. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You'll grow up hearing stories of marriages that became loving partnerships and others that were decades-long Cold Wars. Everything will depend on luck, personality, and the specific circumstances you find yourself in. But right now, at 10 years old, you can't imagine loving the small, scared boy who will someday share your bed and control your life. The months after your betrothal bring subtle changes to your training. Lady Eleanor begins teaching you things she previously withheld: how to manage conflict with a husband, how to protect your own interests within a marriage, how to maintain dignity if your husband takes a mistress. Most will, she says bluntly. Your training is to endure it with grace and ensure your own children are recognized as legitimate heirs. She teaches you to distinguish between battles worth fighting and those you should ignore. A husband who gambles away estate funds must be gently redirected. A husband who beats servants should be reminded that damaged property has less value. A husband who beats his wife, Lady Eleanor pauses here, her face carefully neutral, must be endured unless he threatens your life, in which case you appeal to his family or the church for intervention. This is perhaps the darkest part of your education, learning that your safety isn't guaranteed, that marriage might mean physical danger, and that your main tools for survival are manipulation, patience, and strategic submission. Lady Eleanor never calls it manipulation. Of course, she calls it prudent household management and wifely guidance, but you're learning to influence without appearing to influence, to control without seeming to control, to get your way while making your husband believe every decision was his idea. It's exhausting and demeaning, but it's also the reality of the world you'll inhabit. Some medieval advice manuals for wives actually include instructions on how to nurse a husband back to good temper after he's beaten you, offering him his favourite foods, speaking gently, never mentioning the violence. The system is designed to protect men's authority at all costs, and women's survival depends on learning to work within that system without openly challenging it. A quirky detail from historical records: some families created elaborate bride books that travelled with girls to their new households. These manuscripts contained recipes, household tips, medical remedies, and advice on managing servants, essentially early versions of domestic encyclopedias, but they also sometimes contained coded warnings about specific dangers or advice on protecting money and valuables. One surviving bride book from 14th century France includes a list of hiding places for coins and jewels, written in cipher that only the women of the family could read. These books were tools of subtle resistance, ways that mothers prepared daughters for realities they couldn't discuss openly. You see your betrothed twice more before you turn 13, once at a regional tournament where your families both attend, and once when his family stops at your father's manor while travelling. He's growing, becoming less awkward, developing the broad shoulders that suggest he'll be tall like his father. You try to discern something of his personality during these brief encounters. Is he kind, intelligent, cruel? You can't tell. He's polite and distant, clearly as uncomfortable with this arrangement as you are. You exchange perhaps 20 words total across both visits, yet this virtual stranger will have complete legal authority over you, your body, your property, and your children. The contract signed when you were 10 has already sealed your fate. Do you remember the moment that reality fully sank in? It was like a door closing somewhere deep in your chest, a resignation settling into your bones. This is your life. This has always been your life. And now your training intensifies as the wedding day approaches. You're standing in the great hall, holding a cup of wine you haven't sipped from, and every muscle in your body is screaming at you to set it down or drink it or do something other than maintain this frozen pose, but you can't. Lady Ellen is watching from across the room, and this is a test. For the past 6 months, your training has shifted towards something more subtle and more difficult than embroidery or household management. You're learning the silent language of gesture, the vocabulary of the body that medieval society uses to communicate status, virtue, availability, and intent without speaking a single word. The cup you're holding must be gripped just so, fingers curved gently around the stem, never clutching the bowl because that suggests peasant manners or drunkenness. Your elbow stays close to your body, not jutting outward. When you finally do take a sip, you'll barely wet your lips, because women who drink deeply are immodest and lose control of their faculties. The angle of your wrist as you lift the cup communicates breeding and self-restraint. You've been practicing this single gesture for 3 days, and your forearm aches from maintaining the position. But in medieval aristocratic culture, these tiny movements matter more than entire conversations. A woman's body is always being read, always being interpreted, always sending messages whether she intends to or not. The curtsy alone has 17 variations, each calibrated to specific social situations. You've learnt the greeting curtsy for welcoming guests of equal rank, a modest dip with eyes briefly lowered, then raised to make polite eye contact. The deference curtsy goes much deeper, with your gaze remaining on the floor until the superior person acknowledges you. There's a church curtsy performed before the altar that's similar to the deference version but held longer. A gratitude curtsy accompanies verbal thanks and includes a slight inclination of the head. The apology curtsy is deeper still, almost a genuflection, with hands folded at your waist. You've practiced these curtsies until your thighs burn and your knees ache. Mathilde corrects the angle of your back, the positioning of your feet, the precise moment when your eyes should lift from the floor. A curtsy performed incorrectly insults everyone present. Hand gestures form another complex system. You learn to keep your hands folded at your waist when standing idle, never hanging at your sides like a peasant, never fidgeting. When seated, your hands rest quietly in your lap, palms up in a gesture of openness and submission, or occupied with needlework. Pointing is vulgar and aggressive. Instead, you learn to indicate direction with the subtle turn of your whole body or a gentle incline of your head. When receiving something from a servant, both hands cup together to accept the object, demonstrating respect for the giver and the gift. When offering something to a social superior, you present it with both hands, arms extended, head slightly bowed, a posture of humility and service. Lady Eleanor explains that medieval society is obsessed with these gestures because so much social interaction happens without words. In a great hall full of people speaking different dialects and languages, in a world where many people are illiterate, in situations where direct communication might be dangerous or inappropriate, gesture becomes everything. A noble woman might need to signal warnings to her husband across a crowded feast without their enemies noticing. She might need to communicate displeasure to a servant without causing a scene. She might need to show deference to a social superior while simultaneously asserting her own dignity. All of this happens through posture, hand position, facial expression, and the precise choreography of the body moving through space. Your face. You learn must maintain what Mathilde calls pleasant repose, a slight serene smile that suggests contentment without actual happiness, openness without vulnerability. Your expression should never be blank, which suggests stupidity, or too animated, which suggests loose morals and insufficient self-control. You practice in front of a polished metal mirror that Lady Eleanor's household treasures, adjusting the corners of your mouth, relaxing the furrow between your brows, softening your eyes without losing focus. It's like wearing a mask that's somehow also your real face. You practice maintaining this expression while Matilda insults you, testing whether you can keep your composure under verbal assault. A proper lady never reveals anger, hurt, or indignation through facial expression. Those emotions must be swallowed, hidden, denied. Eye contact is perhaps the most complicated element. Too much direct eye contact and you seem forward, aggressive, even sexually available. Too little and you seem shifty or untrustworthy or simple-minded. You learn to glance at people's faces, register their expression, then lower your gaze respectfully. With social superiors, your eyes remain mostly downcast, lifting only when they address you directly. With social equals, you can maintain slightly more eye contact but must still look away frequently. With social inferiors, servants and peasants, you can look directly, your gaze establishing your authority. But even then, you shouldn't stare, because that suggests improper fascination or cruelty. You practice the timing of these glances until they become automatic. Catch their eye, hold for a heartbeat, lower your gaze, a rhythm that signals both confidence and modesty. Historians still argue whether these elaborate gesture systems were truly universal or varied significantly by region and class. Some scholars point to Italian conduct manuals that emphasize expansive, theatrical gestures, while French and English sources favor more restrained movements. The gestures you're learning are specific to English aristocratic culture of the 14th century, but the underlying principle that women's bodies must be carefully controlled and choreographed appears across medieval Europe. The specific vocabulary changes, but the grammar of feminine submission remains consistent. One particularly quirky aspect of gesture training involves learning to make yourself physically smaller. You practice drawing your shoulders inward, keeping your elbows tight against your body, minimizing the space you occupy. When walking through doorways, you learn to turn slightly sideways, making yourself narrower. When seated at a crowded table, you keep your knees together and your arms close, never sprawling or claiming territory. The message is clear. Women should occupy as little space as possible, should make themselves compact and unobtrusive. It's the physical embodiment of the medieval ideal that women should be seen decoratively, but not heard. Present but not imposing, available but not aggressive. Even your breathing should be quiet and shallow. Lady Eleanor actually corrects you when your breathing becomes audible, reminding you that a lady's breath should be nearly imperceptible. Walking is an entire discipline. You practice the maiden's glide, a way of moving that keeps your upper body completely still while your legs do all the work beneath your skirts. Your head shouldn't bob, your shoulders shouldn't sway, and your arms shouldn't swing. You should appear to float across the floor like a religious icon being carried in a procession. And to achieve this, you imagine balancing a vessel of water on your head, keeping it perfectly level. Your steps are small and measured, never hurried. You learn to manage heavy skirts by lifting them slightly with one hand when climbing stairs, but only just enough to prevent tripping. Revealing your ankles would be scandalous. The rhythm of your walk should be stately and deliberate, suggesting dignity and self-possession. A woman who rushes appears chaotic and unfeminine. Sitting and standing also follow strict protocols. When sitting, you lower yourself smoothly, keeping your spine straight, gathering your skirts with one hand as you descend. Your back never touches the chair's back. That would suggest slovenly posture. You perch on the forward edge of the seat, spine perfectly vertical, hands in lap, feet positioned at a modest angle. When standing from a seated position, you rise in a single fluid motion, no stumbling or lurching. The transition from sitting to standing to walking should be seamless, without any awkward, intermediate moments. You practice these transitions hundreds of times, until your body executes them automatically. Do you remember the afternoon when you realized that you'd stopped thinking about these gestures consciously? Your body had absorbed the training so completely that you curtsied, folded your hands, modulated your gaze, and maintained your pleasant expression without any conscious effort. It was both a triumph, proof that you'd mastered the lessons, and something more disturbing. You've been reprogrammed at a fundamental level. The spontaneous, unguarded child you'd been at 7 was gone, replaced by the carefully constructed performance of femininity. Sometimes you catch yourself alone in a room, sitting with perfect posture even though no one is watching, and you wonder who you're performing for anymore. The surveillance has become internal. The language of gesture extends even to intimate moments. You're taught how to receive a kiss on the hand, extending your arm gracefully, palm down, fingers slightly curved, then lifting your face to acknowledge the gesture with a small smile. You're taught how to accept a compliment, lowering your eyes modestly, perhaps a slight blush, which you can induce by holding your breath briefly, a soft, "You honour me, my lord." You're taught how to signal fatigue at a feast without actually complaining, a subtle touch to your temple, a barely perceptible sway, a softening of focus that suggests you might faint, lest some considerate person suggests you retire. These gestures allow you to communicate needs without the unforgivable sin of directly stating them. The training includes scenarios where you practice combining gestures into complete performances. Matilda plays the role of a lecherous lord at a feast who makes inappropriate remarks. You must respond with gestures that discourage him without causing offence. Eyes lowered or body angled slightly away. Hands positioned protectively at your waist. A cool, distant smile. You're learning to use your body as both shield and weapon, to communicate boundaries through posture alone. In another scenario, Lady Eleanor plays a suspicious mother-in-law examining you for flaws. You must project virtue, competence, and deference simultaneously, an almost impossible combination that requires you to be simultaneously visible and invisible, assertive and submissive, confident and humble. By the time you're 13, this physical vocabulary has become your native language. You can read the room the moment you enter, identifying allies and threats, status hierarchies and social tensions, all through gesture and posture. You can communicate complex messages to other women without speaking, using the subtle shifts that men rarely notice or understand. You've learned that beneath the apparent submission of these gestures lies a kind of power, the power to influence without seeming to communicate secretly in plain sight, to navigate dangerous situations by presenting exactly the image others expect. It's not the power you would have chosen, but it's the power available to you, and you're learning to wield it with precision. You're standing in your shift while 3 women circle you like merchants evaluating cloth at market, and you've never felt more exposed despite being technically covered from neck to ankle. Your mother, Lady Eleanor, and the seamstress are discussing your body as if you're not present, debating whether your hips are wide enough, whether your breasts have developed sufficiently, Whether your waist can be made to appear smaller through strategic lacing, you're 14 now, and your wedding is 6 months away, which means your wardrobe must be assembled with the precision of a military campaign. Because in medieval society, clothing isn't just about covering your body, it's a complex code that communicates your virginity, your social status, your family's wealth, your sexual availability, and your moral character, all simultaneously. The virgin's wardrobe follows strict rules that every observer understands instinctively. White or pale colours dominate: cream, light blue, soft rose, because these shades symbolise purity and innocence. Your hair, which you've grown long and carefully tended for years, must remain uncovered or only partially covered before marriage. This is perhaps the most significant marker of virginity in medieval Europe. Unmarried girls display their hair, while married women cover theirs completely. The logic is peculiar when you think about it. Hair is considered simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, attractive and shameful. An unmarried girl's hair advertises her availability to potential suitors, but the moment she marries, that same hair must be hidden because it might tempt men other than her husband. You've learned to braid your hair in elaborate patterns that demonstrate both your skill and your family's status, weaving in ribbons and occasionally small flowers on feast days. The seamstress measures you with the length of knotted cord, noting numbers that mean nothing to you but apparently determine your value. She explains that your wedding gown will be made from silk dyed a pale blue. Your father has spent considerable money on this fabric, imported from Italy, and the colour choice is deliberate. Blue represents the Virgin Mary, connecting your marriage to divine blessing, while simultaneously emphasising your presumed sexual purity. The gown will have long, fitted sleeves that button from elbow to wrist, with 30 tiny pearl buttons. A design so impractical that it announces you don't do manual labour, that you have servants to dress and undress you, that you're a decorative object rather than a working person. The bodice will lace tightly up the back, creating an artificially narrow waist that may make breathing difficult but will advertise that your body has been properly disciplined and constrained. Medieval fashion for noblewomen involves a fascinating paradox. The clothes must simultaneously conceal and reveal your body. Everything from your collarbone to your ankles should be covered, protecting your modesty, but the cut of the garments creates a very specific silhouette that emphasises your breasts, narrows your waist, and suggests the curves of your hips beneath layers of fabric. You're learning that modesty and sexuality aren't opposites in medieval culture. They're two aspects of the same performance. A properly modest woman draws attention to her virtue, which in turn makes her more desirable as a wife. The covering up is part of the seduction, the concealment part of the revelation. It's enough to make your head spin. Your everyday clothing before the wedding consists of several layers, each with its own significance. Closest to your skin is the shift, a long linen undergarment that you'll wear even while sleeping. This shift is the only clothing you'll be wearing on your wedding night, and your mother has commissioned special ones with embroidery at the neckline, because even your undergarments must be beautiful and evidence of your family's care. Over the shift goes the kirtle, a fitted dress that provides the foundation for your silhouette. Then comes the surcoat, a sleeveless overdress that displays your family's colours or coat of arms on special occasions. A belt emphasises your waist, worn high, just below the bust, in current fashion. The belt itself becomes a status symbol. Yours is made of embroidered silk, with a silver buckle, expensive but not ostentatious. Historians still argue about how much medieval clothing actually restricted women's movement versus how much we project modern assumptions about historical fashion. Some scholars insist that the elaborate gowns made it nearly impossible for noble women to move freely, literally constraining their physical agency. Others point out that women managed estates, travelled, and accomplished complex physical tasks despite their clothing, suggesting the restrictions weren't as severe as they appear. The truth probably varies by specific garment and occasion. Your everyday clothing is relatively practical. You can walk, sit, and work at embroidery comfortably, but formal feast attire with its heavy brocades, restrictive lacing, and floor-sweeping trains genuinely limits your mobility, forcing you into slower, more deliberate movements that become another aspect of performing high-status femininity. One quirky detail from historical records: many wealthy families included wardrobe guardians in their households, servants whose sole job was maintaining and protecting valuable clothing. These guardians knew how to remove different stains, how to store garments to prevent moth damage, how to repair elaborate embroidery, and how to freshen clothes with herbs between wearings. In an era before closets or frequent washing, maintaining an aristocratic wardrobe was a full-time occupation. Some wardrobe inventories survive from medieval estates, listing clothing with the same careful detail used for land holdings or livestock, itemizing every garment, every accessory, every piece of jewellery. Your wedding trousseau will eventually include 37 separate items, from shifts to ceremonial gowns, and all of them will be catalogued in a document that becomes part of your marriage contract. Your shoes tell their own story. Before marriage, you wear soft leather slippers dyed to match your gowns, practical enough for moving around the household, but delicate enough to announce that you don't walk through mud or work in kitchens. The slippers have slightly pointed toes, fashionable but not exaggerated like the extreme points that will become popular later. After marriage, your shoe wardrobe will expand to include patterns, wooden platforms that strap over your shoes to protect them from mud and filth when you must venture outside. The patterns add several inches to your height and make walking precarious, but they preserve your expensive footwear and create a distinctive clicking sound that announces your approach, allowing servants to prepare for your arrival. Everything you wear serves multiple functions: practical, symbolic, and communicative. Jewellery and accessories follow equally strict codes. As an unmarried girl, you wear minimal jewellery, perhaps a simple pendant on a chain, a ring from your mother, a brooch to fasten your cloak. Excessive jewellery on a virgin suggests vanity and pride, both deeply unfeminine qualities, but the jewellery you do wear must be real and valuable, because cheap imitations suggest your family lacks resources. After marriage, you'll be expected to wear more elaborate jewellery that advertises your husband's wealth and status. The transformation from maiden to wife will be visible in your ornamentation, from restrained simplicity to elaborate display. It's another way that clothing marks the boundary between virginity and sexual availability, between daughter and wife, between potential and possession. Your mother oversees the assembly of your trousseau with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Every item must be perfect, because once you arrive at your husband's household, these possessions will be scrutinized by his family, by servants, by neighbouring ladies. Any shortcoming will reflect poorly on your birth family, and, by extension, on you. The trousseau includes practical items, 6 shifts, 3 everyday kirtles, 2 formal gowns, a travelling cloak, multiple veils and head coverings for after the wedding, but also symbolic ones. Your marriage nightgown is made of the finest linen, embroidered with fertility symbols, pomegranates, rabbits, vines. It's beautiful and terrifying, representing as it does the wedding night you've been simultaneously prepared for and kept ignorant about. The process of dressing each day becomes a ritual that reinforces your social position. You cannot dress yourself. The lacing and buttons require assistance, which demonstrates that you have servants and leisure time. Your maid helps you into your shift. Then the kirtle, carefully smoothing any wrinkles, she laces the back while you brace yourself against a bedpost. The lacing tight enough to create the fashionable silhouette, but not so tight that you'll faint at breakfast. The surcoat comes next, then your belt, then the careful arrangement of your hair. The entire process takes nearly an hour during which you stand passively while other people construct your public self. You're being assembled like a piece of religious art, a Madonna figure meant to inspire devotion and demonstrate your family's piety and wealth. Do you remember the first time you tried on your wedding gown? The seamstress and her assistant spent 2 hours getting you into it, adjusting the fit, pinning and marking alterations. The fabric felt heavy and stiff, foreign against your skin despite the silk shift beneath it. The tight bodice made deep breathing impossible, and the long train meant you had to relearn how to walk, moving backwards slightly before stepping forward so you wouldn't trip over your own skirts. You looked at yourself in Lady Eleanor's precious mirror and barely recognized the figure staring back. A pale, elaborate doll, dressed in blue and white, her face floating above yards of expensive fabric. Your mother smiled with satisfaction. Lady Eleanor nodded approval. You felt like you were looking at a stranger, at the person you were supposed to become but hadn't quite yet. The veil you'll wear after marriage becomes an object of particular fascination and dread. Lady Eleanor shows you the wimple, a cloth that covers your neck and chin, and the veil that will cover your hair completely. She demonstrates how to arrange them, how to secure them with pins so they won't slip but won't cause headaches either. You'll wear this every day for the rest of your life, she says matter-of-factly, except when alone with your husband at night. The wimple and veil are uncomfortable, hot in summer, restrictive always, but they're also required. The visible marker that you're no longer sexually available, that you belong to one man and are off limits to all others. Some women, Lady Eleanor mentions, grow to appreciate the veil. It provides a kind of privacy, a boundary between the self and the world's gaze. You try to imagine finding comfort in this cloth cage and fail. The colour restrictions become more apparent as your wedding approaches. You can no longer wear bright reds or the deep greens. Those are for married women or women of questionable virtue. Your wardrobe stays in the pale, innocent spectrum. But you notice that married women can wear almost anything. Deep purples, rich golds, even black, because their sexuality is contained within marriage and therefore not threatening. The virgin's palette is limited precisely because virginity itself is a liminal or temporary state. You're neither child nor woman, neither innocent nor knowing. Your clothing reflects that uncertainty, that in-betweenness. Once you're married, once your sexual status is fixed and clarified, more colours become available. It's as if becoming sexually active actually gives you more freedom, at least sartorially, a paradox that would be funny if it weren't so revealing about medieval anxieties around female sexuality. You're beginning to understand that these clothing rules aren't really about fabric and fashion. They're about control. Every garment reinforces the message that your body isn't yours, that it belongs to your family until marriage and then to your husband, that your primary value lies in your sexual purity and your ability to display wealth attractively. The virgin's wardrobe is a cage made of silk and linen, beautiful but confining, decorative but functional, and you're learning to inhabit that cage gracefully, to move within its constraints as if they were natural, to make imprisonment look like elegance. That's the real skill your clothing teaches. Not how to dress beautifully, but how to make subjugation look like privilege. You're standing in the still room with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters overhead, their scents mixing into something both medicinal and comforting. And Lady Eleanor is testing you on plant identification. She holds up a dried stem and you must name it, describe its uses, and explain proper dosage before she'll move to the next one. This is feverfew for headaches, comfrey for wounds, pennyroyal for, she pauses meaningfully, for matters better discussed privately. You're 15 now, months away from marriage. And the domestic arts training has intensified beyond embroidery and pleasant conversation. You're learning the skills that will keep a household running, keep people fed and clothed and reasonably healthy, and ultimately determine whether you're considered a valuable wife or a burden to your husband's estate. The still room becomes your second classroom, and in some ways it's more important than the solar. Here you learn to identify dozens of plants by sight, smell, and even taste, though Lady Eleanor warns you never to taste anything you're uncertain about, sharing a grim story about a neighbouring lady who died from misidentifying monkshood. You learn to prepare tinctures by steeping herbs in wine or vinegar, to make poultices by crushing fresh plants with the mortar and pestle, to create salves by mixing powdered herbs into rendered fat. The measurements are imprecise, a handful of this, a pinch of that, because this knowledge passes orally from woman to woman, refined through generations of trial and error. You're learning a medical tradition that exists parallel to, and sometimes in conflict with, the male physicians who serve only the wealthiest households. Brewing becomes one of your essential skills, and not just because medieval people drink ale with every meal. Water is often unsafe, carrying diseases that your culture doesn't understand but has learned to fear. Ale, fermented and mildly alcoholic, is safer and more nutritious. You learn the entire process, soaking barley until it sprouts, drying it in a kiln, grinding it to powder, mixing it with water and hops, adding yeast, and monitoring the fermentation. A skilled brewer can produce consistent ale that doesn't spoil quickly, a valuable talent that can save a household significant money. You learn to recognise when fermentation has gone wrong, when ale has soured or spoiled, when the barrels need to be cleaned and resealed. Your hands smell perpetually of yeast and grain, and you develop calluses from stirring the massive brewing vats. Food preservation occupies weeks of your training, because keeping food edible through winter means the difference between survival and starvation. You learn to salt meat and fish, packing them in barrels with coarse salt that draws out moisture and prevents decay. You learn to smoke meats in the smokehouse, understanding how different woods impart different flavours and how temperature and time affect preservation. Fruit preservation requires different skills. You make preserves and jams by cooking fruit with honey until it thickens. Store apples and pears wrapped individually in cloth, dry berries in the sun or near the fire. You learn to identify the first signs of spoilage, the smell, the texture, the discoloration, so you can remove bad food before it contaminates an entire storage barrel. The dairy work surprises you with its complexity. You learn to judge milk quality by sight and smell, to detect when a cow might be sick by changes in her milk. Butter making requires patience and precise timing, churning cream until it separates into butter and buttermilk, working the butter to remove excess liquid, adding salt for preservation, packing it into crocks. Cheese making is even more elaborate, heating milk to specific temperatures judged by touch, adding rennet to curdle it, cutting the curds, draining whey, pressing the cheese into moulds, and then aging it for weeks or months. A skilled dairy manager can transform surplus milk into valuable trade goods. You learn to keep careful records of production. How many pounds of butter? How many wheels of cheese? Because accounting for resources is part of your future responsibilities. Historians still argue whether medieval women's domestic work should be considered skilled labour or merely expected female duties. The economic value is undeniable. A competent household manager could increase an estate's wealth significantly through efficient resource use. But because this work happened within the domestic sphere and was unpaid, it often wasn't recognised as real work in the same way that male agricultural or craft labour was. The skills you're learning are genuinely complex and require years to master, yet they'll never earn you wages or formal recognition. You're being trained as an unpaid specialist in an essential economic role. Textile production forms another crucial skill set. You've already spent years learning embroidery for decorative purposes, but now you're learning the practical side. How to spin thread from raw wool or flax. How to set up and operate a loom. How to recognise quality fabric by feel and appearance. You learn to calculate how much raw material will produce how much finished cloth. Essential knowledge for managing household supplies. You learn to supervise dye work, understanding which plants and minerals produce which colours, how to set dyes so they don't fade or run. You learn basic tailoring and repair work, how to let out seams as children grow, how to turn collars and cuffs when they wear thin, how to patch garments nearly invisibly. In a world where fabric is expensive and time-consuming to produce, these repair skills have real economic value. The accounting skills you're developing operate on a purely practical level since formal mathematics education is reserved for men and clergy, but you're learning a kind of intuitive calculation that's remarkably sophisticated. You learn to estimate quantities by eye, approximately how much grain remains in a barrel, whether the meat stores will last through winter, how many candles the household burns per week. You learn to track inventory mentally with simple tally marks. Knowing what supplies need replenishing and when, you learn to detect when servants might be stealing, comparing expected usage against actual depletion, noticing discrepancies that suggest dishonesty. A skilled household manager develops an almost supernatural ability to track hundreds of items and their rates of consumption simultaneously. One particularly quirky aspect of domestic training involves learning the seasonal calendar of household tasks. You memorize which months are best for the specific activities. Slaughter livestock in November before winter feeding becomes too expensive. Make cheese in spring and summer when milk production peaks. Preserve fruit in late summer and autumn as it ripens. Brew ale in cooler months when fermentation is easier to control. Plant kitchen gardens after the last frost. This knowledge connects you to agricultural rhythms and natural cycles, making you part of a vast network of production and preservation. You're learning to think a year ahead, planning now for needs that won't arise until next spring or next winter. Soap making becomes one of your more unpleasant lessons. The process requires mixing rendered animal fat with lye made from wood ash. Both ingredients smell terrible, and the mixture itself is caustic and dangerous. You learn to test the lye's strength by floating an egg in it, to heat the fat and lye together while stirring constantly, to recognize when saponification has occurred and the mixture has become soap. The resulting product is harsh and grainy, nothing like modern soap, but it cleans effectively and represents another household expense you can eliminate through your own labour. Lady Eleanor shows you the burn scars on her arms from years of soap-making accidents, a reminder that domestic work isn't merely tedious, it's genuinely dangerous. Candle making fills several autumn days when you render beef tallow and prepare for winter's darkness. You learn to dip wicks repeatedly into melted tallow, building up layers until the candles reach the desired thickness. You learn that beeswax candles burn cleaner and smell better, but cost significantly more, so they're reserved for the chapel and special occasions while tallow suffices for everyday use. You learn to calculate how many candles a household of a given size will need to get through winter, and you understand that running out means sitting in darkness for hours each evening. The arithmetic is grim but necessary. Do you remember the week you spent learning to manage servants? Lady Eleanor taught you to give instructions clearly but not harshly, to inspect work without appearing suspicious, to discipline theft or laziness without creating resentment that might lead to sabotage. You learned that household management is as much about human psychology as practical skills, understanding who works well together, who needs close supervision, who can be trusted with keys to the storage rooms. You learn to distinguish between honest mistakes and deliberate incompetence, between reasonable complaints and manipulation. It's a delicate balance between maintaining authority and maintaining relationships, and getting it wrong can make your household either chaotic or miserable. Herb garden management becomes your special focus during spring and summer. You learn to plan a kitchen garden that provides fresh herbs for cooking and medicine, to understand which plants grow well together and which compete, to harvest at the right time for maximum potency. You learn to recognize plant diseases and pests, to know when to water and when to withhold water, to save seeds for next year's planting. The garden becomes a living pharmacy and spice cabinet, and your ability to maintain it will directly affect your household's health and the flavour of its food. Lady Eleanor's garden includes over 40 different plants, and you must learn them all. You're also trained in what might be called disaster management, what to do when things go wrong, how to respond when fire breaks out in the kitchen, when a storage room floods, when an entire barrel of grain is discovered to be infested with weevils, when a valuable piece of cloth is damaged by moths or mice. You learn to make rapid decisions about salvaging versus discarding, about whether to discipline servants or absorb the loss, about when to inform your husband and when to handle problems quietly yourself. These scenarios reveal that household management isn't a peaceful, predictable routine. It's a constant series of small crises that require quick thinking and practical problem solving. The breadth of skills you're expected to master is frankly overwhelming. You must be healer, brewer, dairymaid, textile worker, accountant, supervisor, gardener, cook, and crisis manager, all while maintaining the graceful, serene demeanour that proper femininity requires. You can never appear rushed, flustered, or uncertain, even when you're mentally juggling dozens of urgent tasks. The performance of effortless competence becomes another skill to master, perhaps the most difficult now. You're learning that being a successful wife means making complex, exhausting work look easy and natural, never revealing the constant mental and physical labour required to keep a household functioning. Your competence must be invisible, your efforts taken for granted, your value measured only by the smooth operation of systems that people notice only when they fail. You're kneeling on the cold stone floor of the chapel, your knees aching through the thin cushion, and the priest's voice drones on about the sinful nature of Eve and the purity of the Virgin Mary. You've been here for over an hour already, and your back has started to cramp, but you maintain your posture because slouching during Mass suggests spiritual laziness. This is your daily reality now. Religious instruction has intensified as your wedding approaches, because the Church wants to ensure you understand that wifely obedience isn't just a social expectation, it's a divine commandment. Your training has always included religious elements, but now it becomes the framework through which everything else is interpreted. You're not just learning to be a wife, you're learning to be a Christian wife, which means your submission to your husband is inseparable from your submission to God. The theological education you receive focuses relentlessly on a handful of themes. First and foremost, women are inherently sinful. Daughters of Eve who brought death and suffering into the world through disobedience and curiosity. The story of the fall is repeated so many times you could recite it in your sleep. Eve tempted by the serpent, Eve disobeying God's clear command, Eve leading Adam into sin. The priests emphasize that women's sinful nature means they require male authority to keep them on the righteous path. A woman without a father's or husband's guidance is a sheep without a shepherd. Vulnerable to the devil's temptations, you're taught that your future husband's authority over you is both natural law and divine will, established by God himself as punishment and remedy for Eve's transgression. But alongside this message of feminine sinfulness comes the contradictory ideal of the Virgin Mary, the impossible standard you're somehow supposed to emulate. Mary is held up as the model of perfect womanhood, silent, obedient, humble, pure. She accepted God's will without question or complaint. She submitted to her husband Joseph's authority. She suffered watching her son's crucifixion with quiet dignity. The priests paint Mary as everything you should aspire to be, conveniently ignoring that she's a virgin who gave birth to God. Hardly a relatable model for a teenage girl about to enter an arranged marriage. But you're not supposed to notice these contradictions. You're supposed to internalize the message. Be simultaneously Eve-aware of your sinful nature and Mary-like in your purity, humility, and submission. Your confessor, Father Benedict, meets with you weekly, now, to prepare your soul for marriage. These sessions happen in a small side chapel, with you kneeling before the priest as he sits in authority. He asks searching questions about your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. Have you experienced impure thoughts? Have you touched yourself in sinful ways? Have you looked at young men with lustful eyes? The questions make you deeply uncomfortable. But you've been taught that spiritual guidance requires this kind of intimate interrogation. You learn to confess minor sins, vanity about your appearance, impatience with servants, a moment of anger at your mother, while carefully concealing your real thoughts and feelings. Because some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, even to a priest who promises divine confidentiality. Father Benedict provides what he calls instruction in wifely duties. Though the instruction is maddeningly vague and contradictory, you must submit to your husband's authority in all things, but you must also gently guide him toward virtue when he strays. You must be obedient, but you must also manage his household competently, which requires making decisions he may not approve of. You must welcome his physical attentions without complaint, but you must never appear to enjoy them too much, as that would suggest sinful lust rather than virtuous procreation. The impossible standards pile up like stones, and you're expected to balance them all while maintaining that serene, pious expression that suggests none of this troubles you in the least. Historians still argue about how much power the medieval church actually had over women's daily lives versus how much theological doctrine was simply ignored in practice. Some scholars emphasize that religious authorities dictated every aspect of feminine behavior, from sexual conduct to conversation topics. Others point out that plenty of medieval women found ways to work around church restrictions, and that local religious practice often differed significantly from some official doctrine. The truth probably varies by region, class, and individual circumstance. What's undeniable is that religious language provided the vocabulary through which women's subordination was justified and naturalized. making inequality seem not like human choice but like cosmic order. The saints' lives you study offer both inspiration and warning. Saint Margaret of Antioch, swallowed by a dragon and miraculously preserved through prayer, a symbol of virginity protected by faith. Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who refused marriage and debated pagan philosophers, though you notice she was ultimately martyred for her defiance, suggesting that female learning and independence lead to suffering. Saint Agatha, whose breasts were cut off for refusing a Roman prefect's advances, a horrifying story presented as triumphant example of guarding one's virginity. These tales are meant to strengthen your faith, but they also communicate clear messages about the dangers women face and the suffering required to maintain virtue. The good women in these stories almost all die violently, which doesn't exactly inspire confidence about your future. You're taught specific prayers for specific wifely situations. A prayer for patience when your husband is angry, a prayer for fertility when you hope to conceive, a prayer for safe childbirth when your time approaches, a prayer for accepting God's will when your husband takes a mistress or when a child dies. There's a prayer for everything except genuine happiness or autonomous choice. You notice. The prayers train you to direct your emotions toward God rather than expressing them to other people, to transform complaint into devotion, anger into acceptance, fear into faith. It's a sophisticated form of emotional management disguised as spirituality. The concept of wifely obedience is explained through religious metaphor. Just as the Church is the bride of Christ and submits to his divine authority, so are you the bride of your husband and must submit to his earthly authority. Just as Christ died for the Church, your husband protects and provides for you, and you owe him grateful obedience in return. The metaphor makes your subordination seem beautiful and sacred rather than coercive and limiting. Father Benedict speaks of the sweet yoke of marriage, describing submission as a form of freedom from the burden of decision-making, from the responsibility of authority, from the sinful pride that comes with independence. You listen and nod and wonder how something that feels like a cage can be described as liberation. One particularly quirky element of your religious training involves learning the specific prayers and rituals for your wedding night. Your mother, deeply embarrassed, explains that you should pray before your husband comes to bed, asking God to bless the union and make it fruitful. You should make the sign of the cross over your body. You should invoke the protection of the Virgin Mary. The idea is that surrounding the sexual act with religious ritual somehow sanctifies it, transforming animal lust into holy procreation. But the specificity of these instructions, pray before, not during or after, suggests that the Church understands sex is fundamentally separate from spirituality and can only be made acceptable through careful framing. You're also taught about the religious calendar's impact on marital relations. Sexual intercourse is forbidden during Lent, during Advent, on Sundays, on holy days, during your menstrual periods, during pregnancy, and during the weeks after childbirth. When you calculate how many days this leaves available for procreation, the number is surprisingly small. You're not sure whether these restrictions are meant to limit population growth, to assert church control over the most intimate aspects of life, or to provide women with legitimate reasons to reuse their husband's demands. Probably all three, and you decide. The Church's obsession with regulating sexuality reveals both its power and its anxiety. If people naturally followed God's plan, why would so many rules be necessary? Do you remember the sermon Father Benedict gave about the wickedness of women who use herbs to prevent conception? He spoke of it as murder, as thwarting God's will, as a sin worthy of eternal damnation. But afterward, in the still room, Lady Eleanor quietly showed you those exact herbs and how to prepare them. "The Church says what it must say," she whispered, "and we do what we must do to survive." You're learning that official religious doctrine and actual female practice exist in separate spheres, that women have always found ways to protect themselves despite what priests command. But you're also learning to be very, very careful about who knows what you know. The religious instruction includes memorizing long passages of scripture that emphasize feminine subordination. "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." From Paul's letter to the Ephesians, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission." From Timothy, "The head of every woman is her husband." From Corinthians, these verses are repeated so frequently they become almost meaningless through repetition, but their cumulative effect is powerful. They suggest that thousands of years of tradition, divine revelation, and scriptural authority all agree that women should be silent, submissive, and subordinate. To question this feels like questioning reality itself, like arguing that water shouldn't be wet or stones shouldn't be hard. Yet you notice contradictions that nobody addresses. Mary Magdalene was the first witness to Christ's resurrection, trusted with the most important message in Christian history. The Virgin Mary's yes to Gabriel was technically an act of agency. She could have refused. Various women in Scripture show courage, intelligence, and initiative, but these examples are explained away or reinterpreted to remove any hint that women might be capable of independent thought and action. Mary Magdalene was simply following instructions. The Virgin Mary's consent was predetermined by God's plan. The message is clear. Even when women do remarkable things, they're not really acting on their own authority. They're vessels for divine or male will. Your religious training also includes learning to fear your own body and its desires. Sexual pleasure, you're taught, is dangerous for women. It suggests loose morals, sinful nature, the taint of Eve. A virtuous woman endures her husband's attentions, but doesn't seek or enjoy them. You're warned about the dangers of self-pollution, touching yourself in ways that produce pleasure, which Father Benedict describes as sinful, physically damaging, and potentially maddening. The message is that your body doesn't belong to you, that pleasure itself is suspect, that the sensations you might naturally experience are actually evidence of your fallen, sinful nature, requiring constant vigilance and suppression. The weeks before your wedding include daily mass, extra confession sessions, and hours spent praying for God's blessing on your marriage. You kneel until your knees are bruised, recite prayers until your voice is hoarse, and try desperately to feel the spiritual transformation everyone promises will make you ready for marriage. But mostly you feel tired, confused, and increasingly certain that the religious framework everyone presents as absolute truth is actually a complex social construction designed to make your submission seem inevitable and right. You keep this realization to yourself because doubting the church is dangerous, possibly heretical, certainly unmarriageable, so you maintain your pious expression, murmur your prayers, and add this performance, dutiful Christian bride, to all the other performances that now constitute your identity. You're watching your mother fold another embroidered sheet into the massive oak chest that's been sitting in the corner of your chamber for 3 years now, and with each item she adds, your future becomes more real and more terrifying. This chest, one of 3 that will accompany you to your husband's household, represents years of accumulated wealth, countless hours of labour, and the literal price your family is paying to secure your marriage. The dowry system is perhaps the most mercenary aspect of medieval marriage, reducing you to a commodity with a calculated value and yet your entire family has been working toward this moment since you were a child. Everything they've saved, made, and acquired has been building toward the day when they'll hand you and these possessions over to another family, completing a transaction that's been negotiated like a merchant's contract. The dowry chest itself is a work of art. Carved oak reinforced with iron bands, with a heavy lock that requires a key your father keeps on a chain around his neck. Inside, the accumulation is staggering. 20 linen sheets, each one embroidered at the edges with your family's heraldic symbols. 12 shifts of varying quality, from everyday linen to fine silk for special occasions. 6 tablecloths ranging from simple to elaborate. 8 pillowcases, a dozen towels, 4 bed curtains made of wool, dyed a deep blue and embroidered with flowers and bird, 2 feather mattresses, carefully sewn and stuffed. All of this textile wealth represents not just money, but hundreds of hours of female labour. Your mother's work, your older sister's work, your own work during years of training. Every stitch is an investment in your marriage ability, but the linens are only the beginning. The second chest contains household items, 2 pewter candlesticks, a silver salt cellar, a set of copper cooking pots, 6 wooden trenchers, 2 ceramic pitchers from France, a mortar and pestle made of marble, various tools for spinning and weaving, a small collection of precious spices wrapped in cloth, and a locked wooden box containing your personal prayer book and a silver cross that was your grandmother's. Each item has been carefully chosen to demonstrate your family's wealth and your future capability as a household manager. You're bringing your husband not just yourself, but the tools and supplies to help run his estate effectively. It's practical and calculating in equal measure. The third chest contains the most valuable items, your personal clothing and jewellery, the wedding gown, of course, wrapped in protective linen, 3 formal gowns for feast days and important occasions, 6 everyday kirtles in various colours and fabrics, 2 travelling cloaks, 1 lined with fur, multiple veils and head coverings for after the marriage, a collection of belts, brooches and pins. Your jewellery box holds the pieces that mark you as nobility, a gold ring with a small ruby, a silver pendant, pearl earrings, several decorative brooches. These aren't just ornaments, they're portable wealth, items that could be sold in an emergency, proof of your family's status and resources. The monetary portion of your dowry has been negotiated separately and exists mostly as marks on parchment, but your father explained the figures to you last week. 40 marks in silver, an enormous sum representing years of agricultural profits and careful saving. The money will be paid in installments, with the first portion due at the wedding and the remainder over the following year. Additionally, your father is transferring ownership of a small manor house and its associated lands to your husband's family. This property generates income through tenant farming and will substantially increase your husband's wealth. The manor isn't for you, you'll never own it or control it, but it's part of the price your family pays to secure your marriage into a family of slightly higher status. Historians still argue about whether the dowry system functioned primarily to compensate grooms for taking on the financial burden of wives, or whether it served more as a kind of pre-inheritance that gave daughters their share of family wealth. The legal reality was complex and varied by region. In theory, your dowry remained somewhat protected. Your husband couldn't sell it without consequences, and if he died, you'd be entitled to your dower, 1/3 of his estate, plus the return of your dowry. In practice, many widows found themselves fighting their late husbands' families for these entitlements, discovering that legal protections meant little without powerful male relatives to enforce them. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval dowry customs involved the negotiation process itself. Families often spent months or even years haggling over the exact terms, much like modern real estate negotiations. Your father and your future father-in-law exchanged multiple letters, each suggesting modifications to the proposed arrangement. At one point, the negotiations nearly collapsed over a disagreement about how many sheep constituted adequate livestock dowry. A distant uncle had to mediate, proposing a compromise that satisfied both parties. The pettiness of these negotiations stands in stark contrast to the life-altering nature of the transaction, your entire future being bargained over like a shipment of wool. Your mother maintains a detailed inventory of every dowry item, written on parchment in careful script. She reviews it with you weekly, making you recite the contents from memory. You need to know exactly what you're bringing to the marriage because discrepancies could cause serious conflicts with your new family. If your mother-in-law claims you arrived with only 10 sheets when the contract specified 12, you need to be able to defend yourself with specific details. The inventory becomes a kind of protection, documentation of your family's fulfillment of their contractual obligations. Your mother has you practice saying, "The contract stipulates," and "the agreed upon quantity was," as if you're preparing for legal testimony. Which in a sense you are. The accumulation of your dowry has shaped your family's finances for years. Your younger brother's education was delayed because money went toward purchasing silk for your wedding gown. Your father sold a valuable horse to help fund the monetary portion. Your mother has worn the same 2 gowns for 5 years, refusing to commission new ones until after your dowry was complete. The entire household has made sacrifices so that you could marry well, and this creates a complicated burden of gratitude and guilt. You're supposed to feel honoured by their investment, but you also feel like an expensive project, a commodity they're finally ready to sell after years of preparation. The concept of the dower, your husband's contribution to the marriage, is explained to you as fair compensation for your dowry. But the asymmetry is obvious. Your dowry goes to your husband immediately, becoming his property to manage and use. Your dower, the portion of his estate that would support you if you become a widow, remains entirely theoretical until he dies. You can't access it, control it, or make decisions about it. It's a promise of future security that may never materialize, especially since men frequently outlive their wives in an era of dangerous childbirth. Some cynical part of you recognizes that the dower exists mostly to make the dowry seem less one-sided, to create the illusion of reciprocal exchange, when the reality is much more skewed in your husband's favor. Do you remember the conversation you overheard between your parents late one night? Your mother was worried that the dowry wasn't generous enough, that your husband's family would look down on you, that you'd start your marriage at a disadvantage. Your father insisted they'd given everything they could afford, that your husband's family had agreed to the terms, that you'd have to prove your value through your conduct and competence rather than through material wealth. The conversation revealed how precarious your position is, even with a substantial dowry. You'll enter your husband's household as a newcomer, an outsider, someone who must constantly demonstrate her worth and usefulness. The dowry buys you entrance, but it doesn't guarantee acceptance or security. Your older sister, married 5 years now, told you something disturbing during her last visit. Her mother-in-law frequently reminds her how much her dowry cost, using it as leverage in household disputes. "We invested 40 marks in you," the woman says, "and you can't even manage the dairy properly." Your sister's dowry has become a weapon used against her, proof that she's obligated to perform perfectly because her family paid for the privilege of placing her in this household. You wonder if your dowry will be similarly weaponized, if every failure or shortcoming will be met with reminders of how much you cost. The week before your wedding, your father conducts a formal review of the entire dowry with witnesses present, your uncle, a local priest, and 2 respected neighbours. Each item is removed from the chests, displayed, and documented. The witnesses sign the inventory, creating a legal record of exactly what you're bringing to the marriage. It's a tedious, embarrassing process that takes most of a day. You stand silently while men examine and discuss your possessions, commenting on their quality and value. Your embroidered sheets are praised. Your pewter candlesticks are deemed adequate but not exceptional. Your jewellery is carefully appraised. You've never felt more like property yourself, standing there while the things you own are judged and valued. The delivery of the dowry becomes a ceremonial procession. The 3 chests are loaded onto a wagon, covered with canvas to protect them from weather and dust. Your father, several male relatives, and armed guards accompany the wagon on the 2-day journey to your husband's estate. Your mother and the female relatives travel separately in a covered carriage. You ride between them, neither with the men guarding your possessions nor with the women you're leaving behind. The physical journey mirrors your transitional state, moving from daughter to wife and from one household to another, carrying with you the accumulated wealth that proves your family's commitment and establishes your minimal value in your new home. When you arrive at your husband's manor, the dowry chests are ceremonially presented in the great hall before assembled witnesses. Your father and your new father-in-law shake hands, formally completing the transaction. The chests are opened, the contents displayed and verified against the written inventory. Your new family examines everything with expressions that range from approval to disappointment. Your mother-in-law lifts one of your embroidered sheets, holds it to the light, and nods curtly. Adequate. Her expression says, but nothing extraordinary. You stand beside your betrothed, both of you silent witnesses to this exchange of property, and you understand with complete clarity that you've just been purchased. The pretty language about alliance and family union can't disguise the fundamental transaction. Your family paid a price and his family accepted it. You're the merchandiser delivered as promised. Your value calculated in silver, linens and livestock. You're seated on a stone bench in the walled garden, a suitable distance from the young man who will become your husband in 3 weeks, and your aunt hovers nearby like a nervous hawk, ready to swoop in if the conversation becomes too familiar or you move an inch closer to him. This is courtship in medieval aristocratic society, a carefully choreographed performance of restrained interest, conducted under constant surveillance, governed by rules so strict that genuine connection becomes nearly impossible. You've met your betrothed exactly 7 times now, always in public spaces with multiple chaperones present, and you know almost nothing about him beyond superficial observations. He's tall, he has a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles, he's polite but distant. In 3 weeks you'll share his bed, but right now you're not allowed to touch his hand for more than the brief moment required for formal greetings. The rules of supervised courtship are extensive and inflexible. You're never alone together, ever. Even this garden meeting includes 3 chaperones, your aunt, his older sister, and a servant positioned near the gate. Physical contact is absolutely forbidden except for the most formal gestures. He may kiss your hand in greeting or farewell, but his lips barely graze your knuckles and the contact lasts perhaps half a second. You may accept his arm when walking from one location to another, but your hand rests lightly on his sleeve, not his actual arm, and certainly not clasped together in any way that suggests intimacy. You sit at least 2 feet apart at all times. The distance is measured, maintained, and enforced by the ever-present chaperones who materialize like ghosts whenever you shift slightly closer. Conversation topics are equally restricted. You may discuss the weather, preparations for the wedding, neutral observations about the manor or gardens, Pleasant comments about the quality of the food at shared meals. You may not discuss anything controversial, nothing personal or emotional, nothing that might reveal your actual thoughts or feelings. When he mentions that he enjoys hawking, you respond with polite interest but cannot ask real questions or reveal that you find the sport cruel. When you mention your embroidery work, he nods politely but clearly has no interest, and the conversation dies. You're two strangers performing scripted pleasantness, and these supervised encounters do nothing to bridge the vast gulf between you. The exchange of gifts follows its own elaborate protocol. He's given you a book of hours, a devotional text with beautiful illuminated pages, which is an appropriately pious and impersonal gift. You've given him an embroidered purse that you spent weeks creating, demonstrating your needlework skills while remaining properly modest. These gifts are presented formally in front of family members, not exchanged privately. You thanked him for the book with a curtsy and carefully rehearsed words. "You honour me with this gift, my lord. I shall treasure it and think of you during my daily prayers." He thanked you for the purse with similar formality. The gifts are symbolic tokens, advertisements of virtue and good breeding, not actual expressions of affection or connection. Historians still argue about whether medieval couples managed to develop genuine emotional connections despite these restrictive courtship practices, or whether love was simply expected to develop after marriage through proximity and shared experience. Evidence exists for both interpretations. Some surviving letters between betrothed couples suggest real affection and anticipation. Other sources suggest that emotional bonds were considered irrelevant or even dangerous. Passion led to poor judgment, while rational arrangement led to stable marriages. Your culture emphasizes that love isn't a prerequisite for marriage, but rather something that might or might not develop over time, and that a good marriage based on mutual respect and shared interests is preferable to a passionate one based on irrational attraction. The visual aspect of these courtship meetings is carefully managed. You wear your most becoming gowns, your hair elaborately arranged, presenting yourself as attractively as possible within the bounds of modesty. Your family wants him to find you appealing enough to feel satisfied with the bargain his family has made. Similarly, he appears in fine clothes, freshly groomed, demonstrating that he comes from a family of means and refinement. You're both performing desirability while pretending not to care about physical attraction. You notice he has good teeth, relatively rare and genuinely valuable, and that his hands are clean with neatly trimmed nails. These small details matter because they're the only information you can gather about what your daily life with him might be like. One particularly quirky custom involves the exchange of favours, small personal items that symbolically represent the betrothed couple's connection. He gave you a ribbon he wore in a tournament, now slightly frayed and smelling of horse and sweat, which you're supposed to treasure as a romantic gesture. You gave him a small square of embroidered linen, appropriate for tucking into a sleeve or purse. These items are supposed to be kept close to the body, physical reminders of the absent beloved. The custom would be touching if the sentiment behind it weren't so obviously manufactured. You put his ribbon in your jewellery box and rarely look at it. You suspect he's equally indifferent to your embroidered square. The few moments when you've glimpsed something real beneath his formal mask have been precious and confusing. Once, during a feast where you were seated near each other, a servant spilled wine, and he laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound, before catching himself and returning to polite composure. You saw for a moment that he might have a sense of humour, that the stiff formality isn't his natural state but another performance required by circumstance, another time. You noticed him watching you with an expression that might have been curiosity or sympathy, as if he, too, felt trapped in this elaborate charade. But before you could respond, his sister appeared and the moment vanished. The chaperone's presence creates a bizarre dynamic where you're simultaneously together and completely isolated. Your aunt, stationed nearby with her embroidery, isn't even pretending not to listen. She corrects you if your tone becomes too animated, if you laugh too loudly, if you lean forward with too much interest. His sister does the same to him. You're learning that courtship isn't about getting to know each other, but about demonstrating that you can perform the ritual correctly. Actual compatibility is irrelevant. Proper behaviour is everything. You could be the most intelligent, interesting woman in the kingdom, but if you speak too freely or show too much personality, you'll be judged unmarriageable. Do you remember the one time you tried to have a real conversation with him? You asked whether he enjoyed reading, genuinely curious whether he was literate and what his interests might be. He seemed startled by the question, then admitted that he could read but found it tedious, preferring active pursuits like hunting and warfare training. You were about to ask what kind of warfare training when your aunt interrupted with a comment about the lovely roses blooming nearby, forcibly redirecting the conversation to safer territory. Later, she scolded you for asking forward questions that might make you seem intellectual or opinionated, both qualities that men find threatening in wives. You learn that curiosity itself is dangerous, that showing interest in his actual personality violates some unspoken boundary. The physical distance maintained during courtship creates an almost absurd situation, given what's expected to happen after the wedding. Right now, you can't touch his hand for more than a second without scandal. In 3 weeks, you'll be expected to share his bed, allow the most intimate physical contact possible, and ideally conceive a child quickly to prove the marriage's legitimacy. There's no gradual progression, no building of physical comfort with each other. You go from nearly zero contact to total intimacy overnight, expected to navigate this transition with grace and without complaint. The medieval approach to courtship and marriage is like training someone to swim by keeping them completely out of water until you suddenly throw them into the deep end. You've noticed that he seems as uncomfortable with these supervised meetings as you are. He speaks in careful, measured sentences, clearly aware that every word is being monitored and evaluated. When he reaches for his wine cup or adjusts his position on the bench, his movements are stiff and self-conscious. You wonder what he's really like when he's not performing for assembled relatives, whether he's kind or cruel, intelligent or simple, someone you could eventually develop affection for or someone you'll spend decades tolerating. But these supervised meetings provide no answers to those questions. They're theatre, not courtship, everyone playing assigned roles, speaking assigned lines, maintaining assigned distances. The symbolism embedded in these courtship rituals is relentlessly patriarchal. He approaches you, never the reversed pose. He gives gifts first, establishing his role as provider. He stands when you enter or leave a room, a gesture of respect that simultaneously emphasizes your inferiority. He stands because you're a woman, a fragile creature requiring male deference and protection. The chaperones watch you more closely than they watch him, because female virtue is more fragile, more easily damaged, more essential to the marriage's legitimacy. If you were discovered alone with him before the wedding, your reputation would be destroyed even if nothing improper happened. His reputation would suffer minimally. The asymmetry reveals everything about whose sexuality is considered dangerous and who bears responsibility for maintaining propriety. The final supervised meeting before the wedding takes place in his family's chapel, where you pray together for God's blessing on the marriage. You kneel side by side, close enough that you can hear his breathing, far enough that you don't touch. The priest leads prayers about faithfulness, fertility, and wifely obedience. Your intended murmurs the responses in a low voice that you strain to hear. You realize you don't even know what his voice sounds like in normal conversation, how he sounds when he's relaxed or angry or genuinely happy. In 3 weeks, you'll promise to love, honor, and obey this stranger. In 3 weeks, your supervised courtship will end and your real education will begin, learning to live with someone you don't know, learning to read his moods and anticipate his needs, learning to make a life with someone who's simultaneously your closest companion and a complete mystery. You're sitting in your mother's solar 2 days before the wedding, and the conversation you've been dreading has finally arrived. Your mother dismisses the servants, closes the door, and sits beside you with an expression that's equal parts determined and deeply uncomfortable. She takes your hand, a rare gesture of physical affection, and begins to speak in halting phrases about what will happen on your wedding night. The information comes in fragments, euphemisms, and awkward pauses, leaving you more confused than enlightened. This is how medieval girls learned about sex, through whispered, incomplete briefings that emphasized duty and endurance while carefully avoiding any practical details that might actually be helpful. Your mother explains that after the wedding feast, you'll be escorted to the bridal chamber by a procession of women who will help you undress and prepare for bed. You'll wear your special wedding night shift, the one embroidered with fertility symbols. Your husband will arrive shortly after, accompanied by male relatives who will make ribald jokes before leaving you alone together. What happens then is your wifely duty, your mother says, staring at her folded hands. He will assert his marital rights. It may be uncomfortable at first, but you must not cry out or resist. A good wife submits with grace and prays for it to be over quickly. The physical mechanics remain maddeningly vague. Your mother mentions that he will lie with you and that his body will enter yours in a way that might cause pain and bleeding the first time. She assures you the bleeding is natural and expected. In fact, the blood-stained sheets will be displayed the next morning as proof of your virginity and the marriage's consummation. This detail horrifies you more than anything else. Your most intimate, painful, frightening moment will be followed by physical evidence being shown to assembled relatives like a trophy. The violation of privacy seems worse than the physical act itself, though you barely understand what that act entails. Your married sister provides slightly more practical information when she visits that evening. She speaks more directly than your mother could, though still in coded language. It helps if you lie very still and breathe slowly, she says. Don't tense your muscles. That makes it worse. He'll be nervous too, which might make him clumsy or quick. The first time is the worst, and then your body adjusts. She pauses, then adds quietly, "Some women come to find it pleasant eventually, but we're not supposed to admit that. If you enjoy it too much, you're sinful. If you don't enjoy it at all, you're virtuous. Either way, you must never refuse him unless you're ill or it's a forbidden day on the church calendar." The midwife who attended your birth visits the next day. Apparently this is customary, though no one mentioned it before. She's more clinical and practical than either your mother or sister, speaking about bodies with the detachment of someone who's seen everything. She explains that the initial pain comes from the breaking of the maiden's veil. She doesn't use the term hymen, probably doesn't know it, and shows you a small pot of oil that you can use to ease the discomfort. "Apply this beforehand if you can manage it discreetly," she whispers. "It won't eliminate the pain, but it helps. And remember, what seems impossible the first night becomes routine soon enough. Your body is designed for this, even if it doesn't feel that way initially." Historians still argue about how much medieval women actually knew about sex before marriage versus how much we assume they were kept ignorant. Some scholars point to earthy folk culture, agricultural societies where animal reproduction was visible, suggesting that most women had some practical understanding even if formal education was lacking. Others emphasize the strict separation between maiden and wife, the deliberate withholding of sexual knowledge as a way to maintain innocence and control. The truth probably varied enormously by class and region. A farm girl who helped with animal breeding likely understood more than an aristocratic girl sheltered in a convent or noble household. One particularly disturbing aspect of your briefing involves what to do if your husband's desires become unnatural or excessive. Lady Eleanor saw, during your final private conversation, mentions almost casually that some men make demands that are contrary to nature and Christian teaching. She doesn't specify what these demands might be, leaving your imagination to fill in terrifying blanks. If this happens, she says, you should gently remind him of God's laws and suggest consulting a priest. But, she adds with grim pragmatism, choosing your battles is essential. Some things aren't worth the conflict they'd cause. You must learn to distinguish between moral corruption and mere masculine enthusiasm. The concept of wifely duty is emphasized repeatedly. Sex isn't something you have a right to refuse. It's an obligation you accepted when you agreed to marry, a debt you owe in exchange for your husband's protection and provision. Canon law does technically recognize a woman's right to refuse sex during certain circumstances, illness, forbidden religious days, immediately after childbirth. But these protections are theoretical. In practice, you're told, a wise wife submits readily to avoid angering her husband. Refusal can lead to accusations of disobedience, complaints to your family, even physical punishment. Your body becomes his property on your wedding day, and his access to it is considered a fundamental marital right. The frightening possibility of pregnancy is discussed primarily as your ultimate purpose. The wedding night's goal is conception, producing an heir to continue your husband's bloodline and prove your value. Your mother explains the signs of pregnancy: missed monthly bleeding, morning nausea, tender breasts, eventually a swelling belly. She describes pregnancy as a time of confinement and discomfort, followed by childbirth, which is natural but dangerous. She doesn't elaborate on the danger, but you've heard enough whispered stories about women dying in childbed to understand that pregnancy might be the most lethal aspect of marriage. For medieval women, accepting your husband's sexual attention means accepting a significant risk of death. Do you remember asking your sister whether it gets better, whether marriage eventually becomes bearable? She was silent for a long moment, then said, "You learn to endure. Some days are harder than others. Some months he'll barely notice you exist, and that's a relief. Other times he'll be attentive and you do what's required. Eventually you might have children, and they become your purpose, your joy, your reason for enduring everything else. The marriage is just the framework for motherhood. That's what we're for, ultimately." A quirky detail from historical records. Some medieval advice manuals for brides included specific instructions on facial expressions to maintain during marital relations. You were supposed to remain serene and passive, though, showing neither pleasure nor disgust. Too much enthusiasm suggested sinful lust. Too much revulsion suggested disobedience. The correct expression was modest acceptance, a phrase that captures the impossible emotional tightrope you're expected to walk. You're practicing this expression now, in your chamber mirror, trying to achieve a look of calm submission that masks the terror churning in your stomach. The physical preparation for the wedding night includes more than just emotional briefing. You're bathed thoroughly in rose-scented water, your hair washed and dried to gleaming. Your body is inspected by older women for any marks or blemishes that might displease your husband. You're given a special herbal tea to drink. The midwife won't tell you what's in it, but she promises it will ease the transition and calm your nerves. You suspect it's meant to make you drowsy and compliant, to reduce any resistance you might offer. You drink it because refusing would suggest improper reluctance, but you hate that even your consciousness is being managed, adjusted to make the experience easier for everyone except you. The assembled women offer contradictory advice that leaves you more confused than before. Your aunt suggests praying throughout the act, keeping your mind focused on holy thoughts rather than physical sensations. Your cousin, married just a year, recommends pretending to be somewhere else entirely, mentally escaping while your body goes through the required motions. Lady Eleanor, more pragmatic as always, suggests staying present and aware so you can learn what your husband prefers, knowledge that will make future encounters shorter and more efficient. No one suggests that you might have preferences, that your comfort might matter, that the act could be negotiated rather than simply endured. The wedding night has become mythologized in your mind as a threshold between everything you've been and everything you'll become. Right now, you're still technically yourself, your body still yours, your privacy intact, your future still containing some element of unknown possibility. After tomorrow night, you'll be fundamentally changed, physically marked by the breaking of your hymen, legally transformed from virgin to wife, symbolically shifted from daughter to property of another family. The act itself matters less than what it represents. The complete transfer of your bodily autonomy from your father to your husband, the final step in a process that's been underway since you were 7 years old. You lie awake the night before your wedding, trying to imagine what's coming and failing completely. The fragmented, euphemistic briefings have left you with nightmare scenarios ranging from mildly unpleasant to genuinely horrifying. You don't know if it will last minutes or hours, whether he'll be gentle or rough, whether you'll bleed a little or a lot, whether the pain will be sharp or dull or burning. You don't know if you're supposed to speak or stay silent, whether you should look at him or close your eyes, whether you'll be able to breathe normally, or if panic will make you gasp and struggle. Every question you have is unanswered, and asking more questions is considered improper and suspicious. A virtuous bride approaches her wedding night in innocent ignorance. Never mind that ignorance makes the experience more traumatic, more frightening, more likely to begin the marriage with fear, rather than any hope of eventual tenderness. You're standing in the great hall, balancing a silver tray laden with elaborate pastries arranged in a precise pyramid, and your arms are trembling from both the weight and the fear of dropping something in front of 40 assembled guests. This is your final test before the wedding, demonstrating that you can manage a feast worthy of your future status. Lady Eleanor stands in the corner watching with critical eyes, noting every hesitation, every imperfect gesture, every moment when you're not simultaneously supervising servants, greeting guests, ensuring food flows smoothly from kitchen to table, and maintaining that serene, gracious expression that suggests you find all of this effortless. Feast management and hospitality training represent the most public aspect of your education, the skills that will be on constant display and constantly judged by everyone who enters your future household. The complexity of managing a medieval feast is staggering. You must plan the menu weeks in advance, considering seasonal availability, your household's budget, the status of expected guests, religious restrictions on the calendar, and the symbolic messages different foods convey. Serving peacock, for instance, announces wealth and sophistication. Peacocks are expensive, difficult to prepare, and valued more for appearance than flavour. Serving venison demonstrates that your husband has hunting rights, a mark of aristocratic privilege. The presence of imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron advertises trading connections and disposable income. Every dish is simultaneously food and communication, nourishment and status display. You've learnt the elaborate hierarchy of seating arrangements. The high table, elevated on a dais, seats the family and most important guests. Below that, trestle tables accommodate guests of descending status, with placement carefully calculated to avoid insulting anyone. Seating the wrong person too far from the high table can create lasting offence and damage political alliances. You've spent hours memorising precedence rules. Bishops outrank barons, knights outrank wealthy merchants. But what about a bishop's nephew versus a baron's younger son? These questions have real consequences, and getting them wrong marks you as incompetent or disrespectful. The service of food follows strict protocols. Dishes arrive in courses called remous, with each remove featuring multiple dishes presented simultaneously. The first remove might include soups, roasted birds, and fish dishes. The second remove brings larger roasts, pies, and elaborate constructions like castles made of pastry. The final remove features sweets, fruits, and spiced wine. Between removes, servants clear tables while entertainers perform, musicians, jugglers, or poets reciting verses. You must orchestrate all of this timing, ensuring food arrives hot, entertainment fills gaps without running too long, and wine cups remain filled without anyone becoming obviously drunk before the meal ends. Historians still argue about how much medieval feasts were actually enjoyed versus endured as social obligations. Some sources describe elaborate meals lasting 6 or 7 hours, with dozens of courses and entertainment between each. Other evidence suggests that people ate relatively quickly by modern standards, that the feast was more about display than leisurely dining. The truth probably varied by occasion and social circle. What's clear is that hosting a feast was ruinously expensive and logistically nightmarish, exactly the kind of challenge aristocratic women were expected to manage with apparent ease while making it all look simple. Your training includes specific instructions for managing different types of guests. Clergy require special deference. You must personally ensure they're served first, that their wine is of highest quality, that they're offered the choicest portions of meat. They're also more likely to complain if food is served on a forbidden day or contains ingredients that violate religious dietary rules. High-ranking nobles expect elaborate personal attention without appearing to demand it. You must anticipate their needs before they ask, making them feel honoured without forcing them to acknowledge the effort. Merchants and lesser gentry require courtesy, but less elaborate service, and they were usually grateful for whatever hospitality you provide. One particularly quirky aspect of medieval hospitality involves the symbolic sharing of food. You're taught to personally serve your most honoured guests, presenting dishes directly rather than letting servants do it. This gesture, offering food with your own hands, creates a bond of host and guest that carries real social weight. Similarly, when your husband carves meat at the high table, he distributes choice portions to favoured guests, and the quality of the cut you receive communicates your status in the household. Food isn't just sustenance, it's a language of power, favour, and social hierarchy that you must learn to speak fluently. The behind-the-scenes management of a feast is where your real competence is tested. You must coordinate the kitchen staff to ensure dishes are prepared in correct sequence and arrive at proper temperature. You must maintain the serving schedule despite inevitable problems, fires that burn too hot or die too low, servants who drop platters, Dishes that take longer than expected, you must inspect every dish before it leaves the kitchen, checking appearance and temperature, because serving cold food or poorly presented dishes reflects badly on you personally. You must have backup plans for every possible disaster. Extra courses prepared in case the first ones fail. Alternative entertainers ready if the primary ones don't arrive. Additional wine stored in case consumption exceeds expectations. Do you remember the practice feast Lady Eleanor organised, where everything went wrong intentionally to test your responses? The roast was undercooked, forcing you to delay the second remove and quickly substitute another dish. 2 guests arrived unexpectedly, requiring you to rearrange seating and add place settings without disrupting service. A servant spilled wine on a noble's gown, and you had to apologise smoothly while dispatching someone to clean the stain and ordering the offending servant removed from service. A guest made an inappropriate comment about the food's quality, and you had to respond with grace that neither conceded the criticism nor defended yourself too defensively. By the end, you were exhausted and near tears, but Lady Eleanor said approvingly, "You managed, barely but adequately. That's all anyone can ask when chaos strikes." The financial aspects of hospitality create their own pressures. A feast can cost months of household income, straining budgets dangerously. You're learning to calculate costs, to find ways to create impressive displays without bankrupting the estate. Using local game instead of imported delicacies. Stretching expensive ingredients by combining them with cheaper fillers. A small amount of saffron can colour an entire dish yellow. Creating the appearance of wealth while using only a pinch of the costly spice. Decorating tables with flowers and greenery that cost nothing but labour. These economies must be invisible to guests, who should perceive only abundance and generosity. The morning after obligations are equally important. Important guests expect elaborate breakfasts, provisions for their journey home, and sometimes gifts sent with them. Food parcels, small tokens of remembrance. You must appear fresh and energized despite having supervised the feast until late evening and risen early to oversee breakfast preparations. Your ability to maintain gracious hospitality across multiple days through exhaustion and stress demonstrates stamina and dedication that increase your value as a wife. You're also trained in crisis hospitality, how to accommodate unexpected guests with grace and apparent abundance, even when supplies are limited. Medieval travel was unpredictable, and visitors often arrived without warning. Turning away travellers, especially noble ones, was unthinkable. It violated sacred obligations of hospitality and could damage your family's reputation permanently. So you learn to make something impressive from whatever's available, to smile and say, "What an unexpected pleasure," while mentally calculating how to stretch 2 days' worth of food across 4 days and 6 extra mouths. The entertainment coordination adds another layer of complexity. You must hire appropriate performers, musicians for background ambience, more dramatic acts like acrobats or trained animals for special occasions. You must negotiate payment, ensure they arrive on time, brief them on any topics to avoid or guests to flatter. You must position them where they can be heard and seen without disrupting service or conversation. And you must have contingency plans if they are terrible or offensive, ways to gracefully transition away from a performer who's bombing without making the situation more awkward. The symbolic conclusion of a feast carries meaning too. When you personally thank each important guest for attending, when you offer them sleeping accommodations or provisions for travel, when you see them off with appropriate ceremony, all of this contributes to your reputation as a hostess. Guests should leave feeling honoured, well-fed, and impressed by your household's wealth and hospitality. They'll carry stories of your feast to others, spreading your reputation for competence or incompetence based on their experience. In an era before mass media, Reputations spread through exactly these personal encounters and subsequent gossip. The physical toll of feast management is rarely acknowledged. You're on your feet for 12 to 15 hours, moving constantly between kitchen and hall, tasting dishes, inspecting presentations, redirecting servants, solving problems. You're expected to eat lightly during the feast itself. Appearing too hungry seems unladylike, and you need to remain alert and focused. By the end, your feet ache, your back throbs, your head pounds from spoken noise and stress, but you must still greet departing guests with warmth and grace. Still supervise the cleaning that prevents food rot and pest infestations. Still review what went well and poorly with your staff. The work is genuinely exhausting, and you'll be doing it regularly for the rest of your life, hosting feasts to maintain your husband's political alliances, to celebrate religious holidays, to mark family occasions, to demonstrate your household status and your own competence. Your final training feast is scheduled for 2 days after your wedding, a test of whether you can perform under the pressure of being a new bride in an unfamiliar household. Lady Eleanor reviews the plans with you. 30 guests, 4 removes, entertainment between each. You'll be responsible for everything while simultaneously being the centre of attention as the new wife. Everyone will be watching to see how you handle the pressure, whether your training holds up in the real world, whether you're worthy of the substantial dowry your family paid to place you in this household. You review the menu one more time, visualize the timing, practice your gracious hostess smile in the mirror. In 2 days, you'll begin performing this role for real, with real consequences for failure. The feast will be your introduction to your husband's social circle, your first impression on his family and allies. Everything you've learned over the past 8 years has been building toward a moment like this, when you must prove yourself competent, gracious, and valuable through the perfect execution of impossibly complex social choreography. You're lying in bed listening to the midwife and your mother discuss your body as if you're not present, and the words they use in childbearing, hips, good breeding, stock, proven fertility in the family line, make you feel less like a person and more like a prize mare being evaluated before purchase. You're 16 now, married for 8 months, and the absence of pregnancy has become a source of increasing anxiety for everyone around you. This is the truth they never fully explained during your training. Everything you've learned, every skill you've mastered, every accomplishment you've achieved means nothing if you can't produce children. Childbirth isn't just expected, it's your career, your purpose, the only contribution that truly matters in medieval aristocratic marriage. The pressure to conceive begins immediately after the wedding. Your mother-in-law started dropping hints during the first month, comments about how she was pregnant within weeks of her own marriage, pointed questions about your monthly bleeding, suggestions that you might be doing something wrong. By the 3rd month, the hints became direct inquiries. By the 6th month, she'd summoned a midwife to examine you and confirm that you were physically capable of conception. The examination was humiliating. Lying on your back while an older woman prodded your belly, examined your breasts, asked intimate questions about your marital relations. She pronounced you suitable for breeding and suggested that perhaps your husband wasn't visiting your bed frequently enough. The medical understanding of conception in your era is a bizarre mixture of ancient theory, religious doctrine, and folk wisdom. You're told that pregnancy requires a balance of the 4 humours, that your womb must be the right temperature, not too hot or too cold, and that both husband and wife must achieve pleasure during intercourse for conception to occur. This last belief creates a strange paradox. You're supposed to be modest and not enjoy sex too much, but you're also supposed to achieve satisfaction to ensure pregnancy. The contradictions are impossible to navigate. and you're given herbs and concoctions designed to increase your heat and make your womb more receptive. Though no one can explain exactly how they work, your daily life becomes oriented around conception. You drink foul-tasting herbal teas each morning, a mixture of lady's mantle, red clover, and other plants the midwife swears promote fertility. You wear amulets containing prayers and symbols meant to invoke divine blessing on your womb. After marital relations, you lie still with your hips elevated on pillows for at least an hour. A folk remedy that's supposed to help conception. You avoid certain foods believed to prevent pregnancy. Parsley, pennyroyal, excessive vinegar, while consuming others thought to promote it. Eggs, nuts, red meat. Your entire existence revolves around the desperate attempt to perform the one function that validates your presence in this household. Historians still argue about actual fertility rates among medieval aristocracy versus the cultural obsession with childbearing. Infant and maternal mortality rates were horrifically high, which partially explains the pressure to conceive frequently. Families needed multiple children to ensure at least some survived to adulthood. But the intense focus on women's reproductive capacity also served as a control mechanism. A woman's value was literally measured in children produced, making her perpetually vulnerable and subordinate. If you failed to conceive, you could be set aside, divorced, or simply replaced by a mistress who bore your husband's children while you remained a legal wife without purpose or status. One particularly dark aspect of fertility culture involves the blame system. If conception doesn't occur, it's assumed to be the wife's fault. She's too cold, too nervous, engaging in secret contraception, or being punished by God for some hidden sin. The possibility that the husband might be infertile is rarely considered, and suggesting it would be dangerous. You've heard whispered stories of women divorced, or worse for barrenness, whose subsequent marriages produced children immediately, proving the first husband was the infertile party. But these stories circulate quietly, because publicly questioning male fertility threatens the entire social order that depends on patriarchal authority and legitimate bloodlines. The religious dimension of pregnancy is pervasive and oppressive. You pray constantly for conception during daily mass. At bedtime, whenever you pass the household chapel, you make offerings at the Virgin Mary's shrine, light candles, commission prayers from the monastery. You're told that conceiving a child is evidence of God's favour, while continued barrenness suggests his displeasure. This framework makes your body's fertility a referendum on your spiritual worthiness, adding religious anxiety to the already overwhelming practical and social pressures. You find yourself confessing imaginary sins to Father Benedict, desperately trying to identify what you've done to displease God enough that he withholds the blessing of pregnancy. Do you remember the month you were late, and everyone's hope and attention became suffocating? Your mother-in-law practically moved into your chamber, watching you for signs of morning sickness or fatigue. Servants whispered and smiled knowingly. Your husband treated you with uncharacteristic gentleness, as if you might shatter. Then your monthly bleeding arrived. 3 weeks late but unmistakable, and the disappointment was crushing. Your mother-in-law's face hardened with anger. Your husband avoided you for days. You felt like you'd failed an examination that everyone had expected you to pass, and the failure was visible and shameful. The folk remedies for encouraging pregnancy become increasingly bizarre and desperate. The midwife suggests you consume specific animal organs, rabbit ovaries, cow uterus, to strengthen your own reproductive capacity through sympathetic magic. She gives you a blessed rabbit's foot to wear against your skin, She instructs you to sleep with your head pointing east and to conceive only during specific moon phases. You follow every instruction despite suspecting they're nonsense. Because what if they work? What if your skepticism itself is the problem? A lack of faith that prevents conception. The desperation makes you willing to try anything, no matter how ridiculous. The physical dangers of childbirth lurk beneath every conversation about pregnancy. You know the statistics even if no one states them directly. Approximately 1 in 3 women dies from pregnancy or childbirth-related complications at some point during their reproductive years. Maternal mortality rates are horrific by modern standards, making each pregnancy a genuine risk to your life. Yet you're expected to embrace this danger eagerly, to want pregnancy despite knowing it might kill you, because producing heirs is your fundamental purpose. The calculus is grim. Your life matters less than the potential children you might produce. When you finally do conceive in your 9th month of marriage, the relief is overwhelming and terrifying simultaneously. The missed bleeding, the morning nausea, the tender breasts all announce pregnancy, and suddenly you're treated as both precious and fragile. Your mother-in-law's hostility transforms into hovering concern. Your husband visits your chamber more frequently, checking on your well-being. Servants treat you with deference previously absent. You've achieved your purpose, proven your value, and now everyone has a vested interest in keeping you alive until you deliver this child. But you're also acutely aware that the danger is just beginning. That pregnancy is merely the preliminary phase before childbirth itself, the event that will either confirm your success or end your life. The pregnancy brings new restrictions and expectations. You're told to avoid sudden movements, loud noises, frightening sights, anything that might mark the baby or cause miscarriage. You're supposed to rest frequently, but not too much. Walk gently, but not too far. Eat for 2, but not gain excessive weight. The contradictory advice is maddening, and underneath it all runs the current of blame. If something goes wrong with the pregnancy, it will be because you did something wrong. You failed to rest enough or rested too much, ate the wrong foods or avoided the right ones, moved too vigorously or too sluggishly. The responsibility for a successful pregnancy rests entirely on your shoulders. While the medical understanding of pregnancy is so limited that success or failure is essentially random, the months of pregnancy are simultaneously the most protected and most anxious period of your life so far. You're excused from the most strenuous household duties, allowed to skip evening entertainments when you're tired, given choice foods to support your health and the baby's development, but you're also constantly monitored and assessed. Your size, your colour, your energy levels all interpreted as signs of the pregnancy's progress. The midwife visits weekly, palpating your belly, listening for the baby's movements, pronouncing judgments about its position and health based on evidence you can't verify. You're living in a state of suspended anxiety, waiting for the childbirth that will either make you a mother or kill you, with no way to predict which outcome awaits. A quirky historical detail: some medieval households kept elaborate pregnancy records documenting the mother's symptoms, cravings, and experiences, believing these details would help predict the child's temperament and future. Your mother-in-law has started such a record for your pregnancy, noting that you crave sour things, suggesting the child will have a sharp wit, that you carry the weight low, suggesting a boy, that you seem calm and pleasant, suggesting a mild-tempered child. These predictions are completely unscientific, but they represent an attempt to gain some sense of control over the unpredictable process of pregnancy and birth. Everyone wants to believe they can read the signs, predict the outcome, influence the result through proper behaviour and prayers, As your belly swells and your body transforms, you understand viscerally what all your training was ultimately for. The embroidery and deportment, the feast management and herb knowledge, the prayers and submission, all of it was merely preparation for this. Your real value lies in your uterus, your ability to endure pregnancy and survive childbirth, your capacity to produce legitimate heirs. Everything else is decoration, a way to pass time and demonstrate breeding. But this is the work that matters. Childbirth isn't just an expectation, it's your career, your calling, the only contribution that will be remembered after you're gone, whether you survive it or not, whether you find fulfillment in it or not. This is what your entire life has been building towards since the age of 7, when your childhood ended and your training began. You're standing at the narrow window of a convent cell watching your family's carriage disappear down the muddy road, and instead of the grief you're supposed to feel, you're experiencing something unexpected. Relief. You're one of the lucky ones, though your family doesn't see it that way. At 14, when your betrothal fell through after your intended husband died in a hunting accident, you made a choice that shocked everyone. You announced your intention to take religious vows, rather than accept another marriage arrangement. Your father was furious, your mother wept, but canon law was on your side. A woman could choose the convent over marriage, and once that choice was made and accepted by the church, families had limited ability to interfere. Not every girl submitted to the bridal training regime. Some resisted, some escaped, and some found creative alternatives to the future that had been planned for them since childhood. The forms of resistance varied enormously by circumstance and courage. Some girls simply refused, an act of defiance that took extraordinary bravery given the consequences. You knew a girl at Lady Elena's household who, when her wedding day arrived, locked herself in her chamber and screamed that she'd rather die than marry the man her father had chosen. The standoff lasted 3 days, with the bride barricaded inside while family members pleaded, threatened, and eventually broke down the door. She was dragged to the chapel and forced through the ceremony. The witnesses said she never spoke the required words of consent. The priest simply proceeded as if she had. That marriage lasted 2 miserable years before she died in childbirth, and everyone said it was God's judgment on her disobedience. Her resistance failed, but she tried. Other girls employed more subtle forms of resistance. Feigning illness was common. If you could convince everyone you were too sick for marriage, you might delay or avoid it entirely. Some girls refused to eat, becoming dangerously thin and therefore less attractive to potential husbands and seemingly unable to bear children. This kind of resistance was dangerous. You could genuinely damage your health or even die from starvation. But for some girls, the risk seemed preferable to forced marriage. Historians have documented cases of medieval women who engaged in what we might now recognize as eating disorders, though the medieval understanding framed it as either religious devotion, holy fasting, or feminine hysteria, rather than recognizing it as protest against impossible circumstances. The convent option provided the most legitimate escape route, though calling it escape might be too generous. Convents required dowries almost as substantial as marriage dowries, so this path was only available to families with means. But for girls who took religious vows, the convent offered education, purpose, and escape from sexual subjugation. You've met older nuns who speak frankly about their choices. Many of them chose religious life explicitly to avoid marriage, pregnancy, and the dangers of childbirth. "I'd rather serve God than serve a husband," one elderly nun told you. "At least God doesn't beat me or force himself on me nightly." The comment was shockingly direct, but it captured a reality that many women understood. The convent, despite its restrictions and hardships, offered more autonomy than marriage. Historians still argue about whether medieval convents were refuges for women or simply different forms of patriarchal control. The church hierarchy was entirely male, and convents operated under male authority even while providing women with leadership opportunities and intellectual pursuits unavailable in secular life. Some convents became centres of learning where women studied theology, copied manuscripts, composed music, and managed substantial economic enterprises. Other convents were essentially warehouses for unmarriageable women, those with disabilities, those from families that couldn't afford marriage dowries, those who'd been disgraced somehow. The experience varied enormously by location and individual circumstance. One particularly interesting form of resistance involved strategic scandal. If a girl could engineer a situation that damaged her reputation, being discovered alone with an inappropriate man, for instance, she might become unmarriageable to high-status families, while still finding a husband among lower ranks or avoiding marriage entirely. This was a dangerous gambit that could backfire catastrophically, resulting in genuine disgrace of violence or forced marriage to someone even worse than the original match. But some girls calculated that even a damaged reputation was preferable to the specific marriage being arranged for them. These acts of rebellion required courage and desperation in equal measure. Running away was rare but not unheard of. Medieval society offered limited places for unattached women to hide. You couldn't simply establish an independent household or get a job in another town without explaining your circumstances. But some girls fled to convents and claimed sanctuary, appealing to church protection against forced marriage. Others disappeared into towns and cities, perhaps finding work as servants under false names, perhaps falling into prostitution because no other survival options existed. The mortality rate for runaway girls was probably horrific, but historical records rarely capture these stories. We know they happened because of legal complaints from fathers seeking to reclaim their daughters, not from the girls' own accounts. Do you remember hearing about Margaret of Yorkshire, whose story circulated as a cautionary tale? She was betrothed at 12 to a man in his 40s, a widower looking for a young wife to bear more children. Margaret waited until the wedding day, then during the ceremony announced that she'd already married someone else in secret, a young man from her village whom she actually loved. The secret marriage, if valid, would make the arranged marriage impossible under church law. Her father disputed the secret marriage's validity, but the resulting legal battle delayed everything for 2 years. By the time the church ruled in her father's favour, declaring the secret marriage invalid, the widower had found another bride, and Margaret's father had to negotiate a less advantageous match for his now older daughter. Margaret's resistance didn't fully succeed, but it disrupted the plans and extracted costs from everyone involved. Some girls used their religious training as a form of resistance. By claiming religious visions or divine callings, they could argue that God himself opposed the planned marriage. This was risky. Claims of religious visions could be dismissed as hysteria or fraud, or they might be taken seriously enough to bring church investigation. But for girls from devout families, claiming God had other plans for you was one of the few arguments that might actually be respected. You've read about medieval women mystics whose religious visions began as strategies to avoid marriage and developed into genuine spiritual vocations that brought them authority and influence impossible to achieve as wives. Passive resistance was probably the most common form. Girls who couldn't refuse outright might make themselves as disagreeable as possible, sullen, disobedient, incompetent at all the skills they had been taught. The goal was to make yourself seem like such a terrible wife prospect that the marriage would be called off. This strategy rarely worked because families had already invested too much in the betrothal arrangements to back out easily, and husbands could correct disagreeable wives through force. But some girls tried anyway, hoping that consistent unpleasantness might at least give them some leverage or control within an otherwise powerless situation. The physical violence that often met resistance is important to acknowledge. Girls who refused marriage too forcefully might be beaten, confined, or starved into submission. Parents had legal authority over their children that included physical punishment, and society generally supported using force to overcome female disobedience. You've heard stories whispered among women about girls who were tied during their wedding ceremonies to prevent them from fleeing, or who were locked in their chambers for weeks before the wedding to break their resistance. The medieval world wasn't kind to women who challenged authority, and resistance came with very real physical dangers. A quirky historical detail. Some medieval contracts actually included clauses addressing what would happen if the bride refused to cooperate. These prenuptial agreements might specify penalties the bride's family would pay if she proved too disobedient, or conditions under which the marriage could be annulled. The existence of these clauses reveals that bridal resistance was common enough that families planned for it contractually. The legal system recognized that some women would resist and created frameworks to manage that resistance, not to prevent forced marriage, but to clarify who bore financial responsibility when it occurred. The women who successfully avoided marriage often paid high prices in other ways. Unmarried women had limited legal rights and social status. They remained under their father's authority until his death, then passed to brothers' control. They couldn't own property independently, couldn't make contracts, couldn't testify in court with the same credibility as married women or men. The convent offered one form of escape, but required embracing poverty, chastity, and obedience to church authority. Independence, as we understand it today, simply wasn't available to medieval women regardless of their marital status. The choice wasn't between freedom and oppression, but between different forms of constraint. Your own decision to enter the convent was motivated by complex calculations. The life here is hard. Cold stone cells, minimal food, hours of prayer, constant discipline. But you have access to books. You're learning to read Latin fluently, or you're being trained to manage the convent's finances and eventually might become an administrator with real authority. You'll never face the terror of childbirth or the degradation of submitting to a husband's demands. You've traded one set of restrictions for another, but at least these restrictions don't involve your body being used by someone else. Don't carry the high probability of death in childbed. Don't reduce you to a breeding vessel whose only value lies in successful pregnancy. Here, you have purpose beyond reproduction. Here, your mind matters as much as your body. It's not freedom, but it's better than the alternative that was planned for you. As you settle into convent life, you think often of the girls still in training, the ones who couldn't or wouldn't refuse, who are learning to embroider their own subjugation, who will soon find themselves married to strangers and expected to endure with grace. You think about the system that creates this reality, the elaborate machinery of training and coercion that transforms girls into wives. You wonder whether future generations will look back and see the horror embedded in these practices, or whether this will simply continue forever. Each generation of girls trained to accept what their mothers accepted, passing the torch of submission from mother to daughter across centuries. You don't have answers, but you know you're grateful, guilty and grateful, to have found your narrow escape. You're sitting in a Venetian palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal, and the scene before you would scandalise Lady Eleanor back in England. Your Italian tutor is a man. You're learning mathematics and classical rhetoric, and your mother is negotiating a marriage contract that includes provisions for you to continue managing your family's trading business after the wedding. Regional variations across medieval Europe meant that bridal training looked radically different depending on where you lived, and the experiences of girls in Italy, Scandinavia, Iberia, and England could be as different as if they inhabited entirely separate worlds. Geography and culture created vastly different expectations, opportunities, and constraints for women preparing for marriage, though certain underlying patterns of patriarchal control remained consistent everywhere. In the Italian city-states, particularly among merchant families, bridal training included commercial education that would shock Northern European aristocrats. You're learning accounting because your future husband expects you to manage the family business when he's travelling on trading ventures. You're studying contracts and commercial law because you'll be signing agreements in his absence. You're learning to read and write not just in Italian but in the commercial languages, some Latin, bits of Arabic for dealing with Mediterranean traders, enough French for northern markets. Your embroidery skills matter less than your ability to calculate profit margins and detect fraudulent contracts. The Italian approach to marriage recognised women as economic partners, not merely ornamental dependents, though this recognition was purely practical rather than ideologically progressive. Travel north to Scandinavia, and the picture changes dramatically. Viking-influenced cultures retained customs that gave women more legal rights and social authority than their southern European counterparts. You might have learned weapons handling alongside domestic skills. Scandinavian women were expected to defend households when men were away on raids or trading expeditions. Property rights were more favourable. Women could inherit land and manage it independently. Divorce was more accessible, with women able to initiate separation under certain circumstances. The climate's harshness created a culture where everyone's labour was essential for survival, making rigid gender divisions less sustainable. Women's work included not just domestic management but agricultural labour, animal husbandry, and even boat handling in coastal communities. In Iberia, the intersection of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures created unique complexities. Christian girls in the northern kingdoms received training similar to their French and English counterparts, but southern regions showed Islamic influences in women's domestic confinement and veiling practices. Jewish communities maintained their own distinct traditions, with bridal training emphasizing religious education alongside domestic skills. Girls learned Hebrew prayers, studied religious texts with their mothers, and prepared for the responsibility of maintaining kosher households. The legal status of Jewish women varied dramatically depending on the local Christian or Muslim authorities, creating layers of vulnerability that Christian women didn't face. Muslim women in Iberian territories learned domestic skills within harems. Their training focused on pleasing husbands in a polygamous system where competition among wives was expected and managed through elaborate household hierarchies. Historians still argue about whether regional variations in women's status were as significant as they appear in legal codes and the cultural texts. Some scholars emphasize real differences. Scandinavian women genuinely had more property rights. Italian merchant wives genuinely participated in commercial life. Others argue that despite legal variations, lived experience of most women was similarly constrained everywhere. That patriarchal control manifested differently, but was equally effective across regions. The truth probably contains both perspectives. Real variations existed, but they occurred within a framework of male dominance that transcended geographic boundaries. Eastern European regions presented their own distinct patterns. In areas of Poland and Russia, the institution of the terem, segregated women's quarters, meant that bridal training happened almost entirely separate from male observation. Girls learned from mothers, grandmothers, and aunts in spaces men rarely entered. This created a parallel women's culture with its own traditions, knowledge systems, and hierarchies. The skills emphasized included elaborate textile work. Russian embroidery and lace-making reached extraordinary levels of complexity, but also the folk medicine and spiritual practices that Orthodox Christianity had absorbed from earlier pagan traditions. Women's domestic authority could be substantial once they became mothers-in-law in multi-generational households, giving them something to work toward even within confined circumstances. German-speaking territories emphasized a concept called Hausvater, household father authority, which centralized power in the male household head more explicitly than some other regions. Bridal training there focused intensely on obedience and submission, with less emphasis on management skills and more on subordination. Protestant Reformation regions would later develop slightly different patterns, with Martin Luther's theology emphasizing marriage as a holy calling rather than an inferior state to religious celibacy. This theological shift didn't meaningfully improve women's status, but it did change how marriage was conceptualized and thus how girls were prepared for it. Post-Reformation Protestant bridal training emphasized literacy so women could read scripture, though always with the understanding that women were to interpret the Bible under male guidance. French aristocratic culture developed particularly elaborate codes of courtly love and chivalry that influenced bridal training in distinctive ways. Girls learned the language of fin amour, refined love, and the elaborate social games of courtship that made the French court famous and scandalous. This training emphasized wit, verbal dexterity, and sophisticated flirtation within strictly controlled boundaries. French noblewomen were expected to manage salons, facilitate political alliances through charm and conversation, and deploy femininity as a form of soft power. The training was less focused on domestic competence and more on social performance, creating women who were both highly cultured and deeply constrained by elaborate behavioural codes. Do you remember reading about the Beguines, religious communities of women in the Low Countries who lived semi-monastic lives without taking full vows? These communities offered an alternative to both marriage and the convent, allowing women to live together, support themselves through textile work and teaching, and maintain relative autonomy. The Beguine movement revealed that where social conditions permitted, women would create alternative structures if given the chance. But these communities faced constant church suspicion and were eventually suppressed, suggesting that allowing women too much independence was intolerable to religious and secular authorities regardless of region. Regional variations in dowry practices created vastly different economic situations for brides. In some Italian city-states, dowries became so inflated that families with multiple daughters faced financial ruin, leading to elaborate public regulations attempting to limit dowry amounts. In Scandinavia, the groom's family traditionally paid a bride price to the woman's family, a reversal of the usual pattern that reflected different property customs. In some Germanic regions, the Morgengabe, morning gift, given by husband to wife after the wedding night became as important as the dowry itself, creating a more reciprocal exchange. These economic variations weren't just technical details, they substantially affected women's security, their families' calculations about marriage timing, and the negotiating leverage available to different parties. Climate and geography influenced bridal training in practical ways rarely acknowledged in formal historical accounts. Mediterranean girls learned to manage households without chimneys, to preserve food in olive oil rather than through freezing or heavy salting, to cope with water scarcity and intense summer heat. Northern European girls learned to manage months of darkness, to preserve food through brutal winters, to maintain warmth in stone buildings that were desperately cold. These practical skills varied as much as cuisine and architecture, and a bride moving from one climate zone to another faced steep learning curves that could affect her perceived competence. A particularly quirky regional variation. In some Scottish Highland communities, a custom called bundling allowed courting couples to sleep in the same bed before marriage, though theoretically fully clothed and separated by a bundling board. This practice would have been absolutely scandalous in southern European Catholic regions, but was accepted in rural Scottish areas as a practical way for couples to get to know each other in cramped households where privacy was impossible. The existence of bundling reveals how dramatically courtship practices could vary, even within relatively small geographic areas, and how local customs sometimes overrode official religious doctrine. The social class variations within regions were as significant as the geographic variations between them. A Venetian merchant's daughter and a Venetian peasant girl inhabited different worlds despite living in the same city. The merchant's daughter learned commerce and literacy. The peasant girl learned agricultural labour and basic survival skills. Both were being prepared for marriage, but their training and their resulting marriages were so different that comparing them seems almost meaningless. The training described throughout this narrative focuses primarily on aristocratic and wealthy merchant families, because those are the experiences documented in surviving historical sources. The training that the vast majority of medieval girls received, peasant and working class girls, was simultaneously more practical and less elaborate, focused on immediate survival rather than status performance. As you complete your Italian commercial training and prepare for a marriage that will position you as a business partner, rather than merely a dependent wife, you reflect on how different your experience has been from your English cousins. They learned embroidery and submission. You learned arithmetic and negotiation, yet you're all being prepared for the same fundamental reality. Lives defined by marriage to men, bodies available for men's use, futures contingent on men's choices. The specific skills vary, but the underlying structure remains constant. Women exist to serve male interests, to reproduce male lineages, to facilitate male ambitions. Geography determines the details of your cage. But a cage it remains, regardless of whether it's decorated with English embroidery or Venetian accounting ledgers. You're standing behind the counter of your family's textile shop in Norwich, and the scene before you represents a radically different vision of medieval womanhood than anything Lady Eleanor taught. Your mother is negotiating a bulk order with a visiting merchant, her voice confident and knowledgeable as she discusses thread counts, dye quality and delivery schedules. Your older sister manages the account books at a desk in the corner, her fingers moving rapidly across the abacus as she calculates profits and expenses. Your father is present, but he's not dominating the conversation. He's a partner in this enterprise, not its sole authority. You're a merchant's daughter, and your bridal training includes something aristocratic girls rarely receive: preparation for economic partnership, business competence, and a marriage that will be as much about commerce as about children. The merchant class occupied a peculiar position in medieval society. Wealthy enough to afford elaborate weddings and substantial dowries, but not noble enough to focus purely on status display and bloodline. Merchant families needed productive partnerships where wives could run businesses during husbands' frequent trading absences. This practical necessity created space for women's economic education that was simultaneously progressive and still thoroughly patriarchal. You're learning to be useful, not to be free. Your training prepares you to increase family wealth, not to control your own destiny. But within those constraints, merchant daughters developed skills and authority that aristocratic women might envy. Your education includes literacy and numeracy at levels that would shock noble families. You've been reading since age 6. Not religious texts primarily, though those too, but commercial documents, contracts, receipts, inventory lists. You can calculate percentages in your head, figure profit margins, convert between different currencies and measurement systems. You understand wool grades, fabric weights, dye qualities. You can recognize quality materials by touch and spot fraudulent goods that might deceive less experienced buyers. These skills are valuable, marketable, and give you competence that translates to authority within your household and community. The accounting work you're learning is genuinely complex. Medieval bookkeeping might seem primitive by modern standards. No double entry system yet, no standardized formats, but tracking inventory, managing credit relationships, calculating profits across multiple transactions and occurrences requires sophisticated mathematical thinking. You're learning to maintain ledgers that record what's owed and owing, who's paid and who's delayed, which customers are reliable and which require cash up front. This knowledge makes you a genuine business asset, not merely a decorative wife. Your future husband will depend on your competence to maintain his enterprise during his absences, and the dependence creates a form of power unavailable to women whose only role is ornamental. Historians still argue about whether merchant wives' business activities constituted real economic power or simply represented an extension of domestic labour into commercial spheres. Some scholars emphasize that women managed businesses, signed contracts, appeared in court to settle commercial disputes, all activities that demonstrated agency and authority. Others note that women's business activities were always legally contingent on male permission, that husbands could revoke access at any time, that widows' business control evaporated when they remarried. The truth contains both realities. Merchant women had more practical authority than aristocratic women, but that authority existed within legal frameworks that ultimately subordinated them to male control. Your mother's life provides a model of what's possible and what's constrained. She's been managing the family shop for 23 years since marrying your father. She knows the business as well as he does, arguably better in some aspects. Regular customers prefer dealing with her because she remembers their preferences and needs, but legally, she can't sign contracts without your father's permission. If he died tomorrow, she'd have authority as a widow, but if she remarried, her new husband would control everything she'd built. She's both powerful and powerless, competent and constrained, a walking contradiction that characterizes merchant women's experiences throughout medieval Europe. The domestic skills you're learning differ from aristocratic training in emphasis and purpose. You're learning to manage a household? Yes, but efficiency and economy matter more than elaborate display. You need to feed a family and perhaps apprentices or servants on a moderate budget, not orchestrate expensive feasts for political allies. Your embroidery should be competent but needn't be exceptional. No one will judge your character by stitch quality. You're learning practical medicine because physicians are expensive and your family can't afford to summon them for minor ailments. Everything in your training is calibrated toward productive competence rather than status performance. The marriage your parents are negotiating for you reflects merchant class priorities. You're betrothed as a mercer's son from York, a young man you've actually met several times at regional markets and trade fairs. You've had conversations with him, not just supervised courtship rituals. You've discussed the wool trade, regional price variations, the impact of recent taxes on commerce. These conversations weren't romantic, but they were real. You've gained some sense of his personality, intelligence, and values. He seems competent and reasonable, not cruel. The marriage will merge two trading families, creating new commercial opportunities and expanding both businesses' reach. Your dowry includes cash, household goods, and something unusual, Your father is settling a small shop property in your name, which will generate rental income that legally belongs to you even after marriage. Do you remember the conversation with your future mother-in-law during the betrothal negotiations? She interviewed you almost like hiring an employee, asking about your skills, your knowledge of the textile trade, your ability to manage accounts and supervise workers. She seemed satisfied with your answers, but you left feeling less like a prospective daughter and more like a business acquisition being evaluated for quality and value. The experience was simultaneously more respectful, she cared about your competence, and more mercenary. She was explicitly calculating your economic utility. Merchant marriages don't pretend to be about anything other than business advantage, which is at least honest even if it's not romantic. One quirky aspect of merchant class bridal training involves learning to assess creditworthiness, determining which customers can be trusted to pay on time and which require cash payment. Your mother teaches you to read subtle signs, a customer's clothing quality, whether they meet your eyes when discussing payment, how they respond when you check their account history. This isn't formal financial training, it's intuitive risk assessment developed through experience. But it's genuinely valuable knowledge that will help you avoid bad debts and maintain your future household's financial stability. No aristocratic finishing school teaches these skills because noble families consider commerce beneath them. But these are the skills that will actually determine your economic security. The guild system creates additional complexity for merchant women. Many crafts and trades organize through guilds that restricted membership to men, limiting women's ability to practice those trades independently. But widows of guild members often inherited their husband's right to continue the business, and wives frequently worked alongside husbands in guild-regulated trades even though they weren't formal members. You're learning a trade, textile merchandising, that's not formally guild-regulated in your region, which gives you more freedom but also less protection. The legal landscape for working women is a patchwork of contradictions, permitted here, forbidden there, tolerated unofficially but not recognized legally. Your training involves practical skills that aristocratic women would consider beneath them. You can cut and sew garments efficiently, not with elaborate embroidery but with the sturdy functional stitching. You can dye fabric using local plants and mordants, understanding the chemistry even if you don't call it that. You can assess wool fleece quality, spotting inferior grades that dishonest sellers try to pass off as premium. You can pack goods for transport, calculating weights and protecting fragile items from damage. These hands-on skills mean you're not dependent on servants for every task, that you can work alongside employees when necessary, that you genuinely understand the production processes that generate your family's income. The social status anxiety of merchant families creates its own pressures. You're not noble, but you're not poor. You're wealthy enough to afford some luxuries, but not so wealthy that you can ignore business realities. Your family aspires to respectability, perhaps eventually purchasing minor noble titles if you accumulate enough wealth. This aspiration means you're caught between worlds, learning commercial skills that nobles disdain while also learning genteel accomplishments that signal your family's social climbing. You study music and embroidery alongside accounting and inventory management, trying to demonstrate both productive competence and cultural refinement. It's exhausting trying to satisfy multiple incompatible standards simultaneously. The physical nature of your work differs dramatically from aristocratic women's experience. You're on your feet all day in the shop, lifting bolts of fabric, climbing ladders to reach high shelves, moving between the shop floor and the workrooms and storage areas. Your hands are calloused from handling rough wool and coarse thread. You're strong and capable in ways that contradict the aristocratic ideal of feminine delicacy. When you marry, you'll likely continue this physical work throughout your life, only pausing briefly after childbirth before returning to the shop. Your body is a tool for economic production, not merely an ornament to display at feasts or a vessel for bearing children, though you'll be expected to accomplish those things too. As you approach your wedding day, you feel a complex mixture of emotions that your aristocratic counterparts might not share. You're anxious about marriage, about childbirth, about the loss of girlhood. Those fears are universal, but you're also somewhat confident in your ability to contribute meaningfully to your future household, to be a genuine partner rather than merely a dependent. You know your husband will need your skills and knowledge, which gives you leverage that purely ornamental wives don't have. You're entering a partnership that's primarily economic rather than romantic, but at least partnership implies some mutuality, some recognition of your value beyond your womb and your dowry. It's not freedom, not equality, not anything approaching modern concepts of women's rights, but it's something, a form of medieval womanhood that combined brutal constraints with unexpected competencies, that turned women into economic actors even while denying them full legal personhood, that created spaces for female authority within structures of male dominance. The sun is setting over Norwich, casting golden light across the shop's interior, and you're completing the final inventory before your wedding next week. Your fingers move automatically across the familiar tasks, counting, recording, calculating. You think about the generations of women who've stood in shops and workrooms like this, building businesses alongside husbands and fathers, contributing labour and knowledge that was essential even when it wasn't formally recognised. You think about your future daughters, whether they'll receive the same training you did, whether the merchant class's pragmatic approach to women's work will expand or contract in coming generations. You don't have answers, but you know that for now, in this moment, you're standing at the intersection of possibility and constraint that characterises every medieval woman's life, trained to be useful within systems designed to control you, educated to be competent within boundaries you didn't create and can't change, preparing to make the best of circumstances you never chose but must somehow navigate with grace and skill and stubborn determination to survive. The story settles around you now like a soft blanket, the weight of centuries lifting from your shoulders as you imagine releasing these young women from their training, their obligations, their impossible standards. Think of them, all those girls across Europe, learning their stitches and their submission, their accounting and their obedience, each one carrying forward traditions she didn't create while carving out tiny spaces of agency within overwhelming constraint. Their stories fade into the gentle darkness, becoming part of history's long memory. You can rest now, knowing their struggles and their adaptations, their resistances and their accommodations, understanding how the past shapes the present in ways both visible and hidden. Let your breathing deepen and slow. Let the images dissolve. Let the medieval world recede into comfortable distance. Those young brides have become wives, mothers, grandmothers, dust, their training complete, their stories told, their lives lived within the constraints of their time. And you, floating here in your own moment, can acknowledge their reality without carrying its weight. Sleep comes easily now, bringing dreams of other times and other places, or perhaps bringing only the deep and dreamless rest that heals and restores. The story is complete, the history examined, the training documented. Everything that needed telling has been told. Rest now, rest deeply. The past cannot harm you. You are safe in your own time, in your own bed, in your own life.